CHAPTER IV of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. Chickweed for the Little Birds. Marjolin was found in the Marché des Innocents among a pile of cabbages. No one ever knew what wretched hands had put him there. He was about 3 years old when he was found, fat and happy, but so dull or backward that he did not speak one word. When a woman, turning over the cabbages, suddenly beheld him under a huge white cabbage, she uttered a little shriek, and he stretched out his arms to her. The whole day long the market talked of him. He laughed all day and ate whatever was given him. The woman who first saw him kept him a month. She then passed him on to another, and then to another. When any one said to him, "Where is your mother?" he made a droll little gesture which took in the whole market women. He was the child of the Halles, living first with one of the women and then with another, dressed no one precisely knew how, but always having a few sous in his pocket. A beautiful girl who sold plants called him Marjolin, no one knew why, but the name was adopted. Marjolin was 4 when Mother Chantemesse found, in her turn, a little girl on the sidewalk, outside of the market. The child could not have been more than 2, but she chattered like a magpie in her childish dialect. The woman thought she called herself Cadine, and said that her mother had told her to wait for her, but the little girl was quite ready to go with Mother Chantemesse, and seemed delighted with the crowd and all the pretty vegetables. Mother Chantemesse was a goodish sort of woman, about 60, who adored children, and had lost 3 of her own, and she adopted Cadine. One evening, as the old woman was walking through the market, leading Cadine by the right hand, Marjolin came up and took the child's left hand, without the smallest ceremony. "Well, well," said the old woman, "you are too late. Your place is taken." But when the little fellow smiled in her face, it was too much for her, and she said to him, "Come on. One may as well have 2 as 1, I suppose." And she walked home, leading the 2 children, whom she put to bed in an old hand-cart without wheels, which, if it was a little hard, was clean. Thus did the 2 little imps grow up together, and became inseparable. Mother Chantemesse heard them talking together softly in the night. Cadine, in her baby voice, would tell the most wonderful stories, to which Marjolin would listen in mute amazement. She invented stories as she grew older, which filled him with terror. She was once heard to say that the night before she had seen a tall man, all in white, standing at the foot of their bed looking at them, and when Marjolin piteously begged for further details, she laughed delightedly and called him a great simpleton. For a long time their bed was their playroom. Cadine took her dolls there, and there their white teeth crunched stolen turnips. Each morning their adopted mother was astonished to find leaves and stones, apple cores and bundles of paper rolled up to imitate dolls. On rainy days, or very cold days, they remained in bed half the day, and slept as much as they could. This room, in la Rue de la Lingerie, was a large attic, lighted by one window only. The children played hide and seek there, in the tall wardrobe and under the colossal bed. There were 2 or 3 tables, under which they could crawl. The house had a succession of gutters, into which the children threw stones with such success that they broke 2 windows, and Mother Chantemesse was requested to leave. Cadine and Marjolin spent much of their time in the streets, which they fearlessly threaded. When it rained, they walked gravely, side by side, under an umbrella, which was all in slits, having been used for 20 years to shelter a vegetable stand. They planted it in a corner of the market, and called it their house. On sunny warm days they bathed their feet in the gutter, made little dams across it with stones, hid among the vegetables, and stayed there all night. Sometimes they would be caught, by the delighted chuckle which came from a mountain of lettuces, and when they were rooted out, they looked like scared birds discovered amid the bushes. Cadine could not live without Marjolin, and Marjolin wept when he lost Cadine. When they became separated, they always looked for each other first among the cabbages, which they seemed to prefer to all other vegetables. Marjolin was 8 and Cadine 6, when Mother Chantemesse first made them feel ashamed of their idleness. She promised them each a sou per day, if they would help her pare her vegetables. This was the specialty of Mother Chantemesse. On her table were piled little heaps of potatoes, turnips and carrots, scraped and peeled, ready to pop into the pot of some hurried housewife. She also had soup herbs tied up, and bundles, ready for the pot au feu, 4 leeks, 3 carrots, 1 parsnip, 2 turnips, and some celery tops. Then, too, there were vegetables cut fine, lying on paper ready for a julienne. Cadine was much more skilful than Marjolin, although younger. Her potato parings were so thin that one could see the light through them, and she tied up her herbs in so graceful a fashion that they looked like bouquets, and made the small piles look like larger ones, so skilfully did she arrange them. People, as they passed, stopped at the clear, childish voice which saluted them. "Buy of me, madame, buy of me, only 2 sous." She had her own customers soon. Her little piles had quite a reputation, and Mother Chantemesse, seated between the children, laughed silently at seeing them so intent on their work. She paid them each their sou every night, but they soon grew weary of their undertaking, and determined to enlarge their operations and find more lucrative employment. Marjolin remained a child a long time, much to Cadine's annoyance, who called him a cabbage head. There was some truth in what she said, for he had no faculty for making money, while she was very clever. When she was 8 years old, she was employed by one of the women who sold lemons and oranges near the market, to run after people with them in her hands. She received 2 sous for every dozen she sold, and often made 6 or 8 sous. The next year she sold caps, when her profits were larger. The difficulty here was, that not being allowed to sell them openly, as such commerce is forbidden, she was obliged to evade the police. She saw them a square off, the caps went under her petticoats, and when they reached her she was eating an apple with the most innocent air. After this she sold cakes, galettes, and cherry tarts, biscuits de maïs, thick and yellow. But Marjolin ate too much of her stock. At 11 she realized a great idea that had tormented her for some time. She had saved 4 francs, and she bought a little basket and began to sell chickweed. This was a great event. She rose early and bought her chickweed and her branches of millet, and then she went as far as the Luxembourg, Marjolin with her. But she would not let him carry the basket. He was only good to cry her wares, she said, and he shouted until he was hoarse, "Chickweed, chickweed for the little birds!" And then she would take up the cry, and in a strange musical phrase would call, "Chickweed, chickweed for the little birds!" At this time Marjolin wore a huge red vest, which had belonged to the defunct Father Chantemesse, who had driven a fiacre. Cadine's dress was a blue and white check cut from a tartan once worn by Mother Chantemesse. All the canary birds in the Quartier Latin knew them, and would answer to their cry by fluttering wings and an eager chirp. Cadine sold watercresses also, 2 sous for a basket, only 2 sous. The central halles were now being built, and the little girl was carried away by the long alley of flowers which crossed the fruit market. There she saw 2 thick hedges of roses, and drank in the perfume with exquisite delight. She held her curly head under Marjolin's nose, and he vowed she should never use any more pomade. She finally managed so cleverly, that she obtained a position at one of the flower stands, and lived from morning until night among roses and lilacs, wallflowers, and lilies of the valley. Marjolin, to tease her, would catch the hem of her dress and smell of it. "To be sure," he would say, "lilies of the valley." Then he would snuff at her shoulders. "Wallflowers," he added sententiously. He would hold her hands up high, smell of them. "Lilies, my dear, and your lips are roses." Cadine laughed, called him a goose, and told him to let her be. But in truth she was a living bouquet. The girl rose at 4 to help her mistress at work. Each morning there were huge baskets of flowers brought in, packages of moss, periwinkle, and ferns. On fête days their labours began at 2 o'clock, when more than 100,000 francs worth of cut flowers were sold in the market. On such days only Cadine's pretty curly head was to be seen among her pansies, mignonettes, and marguerites. She was lost among the flowers. In a very short time she had acquired not only skill, but exhibited great originality. Her bouquets did not please everybody by any means. They were even disagreeable to some persons. Reds predominated, combined with yellows and blues, in a barbaric sort of way. On those mornings when the girl had teased Marjolin until he was ready to weep, her bouquets were more than ever fiery in colour. Other days, when she was moved by some joy or some sorrow, her bouquets were soft and tender. They were roses then, or white carnations. Tawny gladioli, like patches of flame among feathery verdure, a tapestry of Smyrna patiently imitated, flower by flower, or fans gracefully spread and soft as lace. Dreams of loveliness to place in the hands of a graceful woman, or a pure young girl. All the strange fancies were those of a child in whom the woman was just awakening. Cadine respected only two things: lilacs, a bunch of which, 6 or 8 sprays, costs in winter from 15 to 20 francs, and camellias, which are dearer still, and which come from the florists, in boxes of a dozen each on a bed of moss, covered with cotton wool. She took them up as she would have handled jewels, with the most delicate care, hardly venturing to breathe lest she should tarnish their exquisite beauty, and with infinite precautions put a fine wire through their short stems. She spoke of them with great deference, telling Marjolin that a white camellia, without a brown or rusty stain, was a very rare thing. One morning, when she was trying to make him admire one, he said, "Oh, yes, it is pretty, but not half as pretty as the skin under your chin. It is no whiter, and not half as smooth." He touched her with the tips of his fingers, and then added, "Everything about you to day smells of orange blossoms." Cadine was not very amiable, nor a very submissive little servant, and consequently established herself on her own account as soon as she could, which of course was at first only on a very small scale. She sold boutonnieres of violets for a sou, which were stuck in a flat basket. She spent her days in the Halles. This was her great delight, and she arranged her violets as she walked with wonderful dexterity. She counted 6 or 8 flowers, according to the season, added a leaf or two, and wound around them a damp thread, which she bit off with her sharp white teeth. Her basket was always full, no matter how many she sold, so quick was she in making them. No matter how rudely she was jostled in the crowded streets, her rapid fingers moved while her eyes were occupied with the shop windows. Sometimes she sat down for a while in a doorway and gave to the very gutter, wherein the dirty water ran, a look of spring. Her boutonnieres indicated her mood. Some were fierce and bristling, others sweet and tender. Wherever she went she left behind her an odor of the country, and Marjolin told her she was herself one big violet. The girl made no further changes. She adhered to the flower business. But as the 2 children grew up, she occasionally left her osier basket at home, and went off with Marjolin exploring the Halles and its cellars. They knew its every corner and dim recess, and were thoroughly at home with the sleeping giant. Cadine and Marjolin had outgrown the old hand-cart in the attic of Mother Chantemesse. The old woman had sent the boy to a neighbor's to sleep, but the children were unhappy at the separation, and liked to curl up together behind the fruit stalls in the market, and as they grew older they often slept in the cellar, and among the baskets of feathers, enjoying the sense of companionship in the most utter innocence. But later, they lived like young and happy animals. Cadine at 16 was a thorough Bohemienne, selfish, sensual, and greedy. Marjolin at 18 was dull of intellect, but good-natured, if a little blasé. Cadine laughed impudently in the face of Mother Chantemesse when the old woman asked her where she had spent the night. When the girl was not with Marjolin, he slept anywhere among the old boxes, but he never left the Halles. It was there they spent their lives. But their great delight was in the especial market devoted to butter, eggs, and cheeses, where every morning piles of empty baskets were found. They selected an enormous one and called it their house. There they lay unsuspected by any one, and shook with laughter when people stopped near them to talk without suspecting their presence. Cadine, in cherry time, armed herself with any amount of stones, which she threw at the noses of all the old women who passed, which was all the better fun for them, as the poor old things could not divine whence came the hailstorm. They amused themselves by following the track of the subterranean railway, the deserted avenues with its streaks of daylight coming through the gratings, the dark corners lighted by gas. The whole place seemed to belong to them. Occasionally, on moonlight nights, they climbed upon the roofs by the narrow staircase at each angle, and found a wide field of zinc spread before them. But they did not stop here. They went still higher, until only the sky was above them. At this height the air was very pure. The wind swept away all the bad odors from the market, and at daybreak they sat on the edge of the roof by the gutters with the sparrows. Cadine laughed aloud, with a sound like the cooing of a dove. Marjolin, when they came down, said they had been in the country. It was at the tripe market that they first made the acquaintance of Claude Lantier. They went there every day. They liked to watch the carts drive up. They looked at the lambs' feet, which were piled up like dirty paving stones, the huge red tongues and bullocks' hearts. They shivered as they saw the bloody heads and thought of a guillotine; but, fascinated, followed them to the cellar, and saw them broken one by the butchers with a mallet, and the brains taken out. Toward evening, between 4 and 5, Cadine and Marjolin were sure of meeting Claude, who was in an ecstasy at the beauty of coloring. The painter became the great friend of the two gamins. He contemplated a colossal picture of the two young lovers in the market among the meats, vegetables, and fish. He dreamed of an artistic manifesto of the positivism of art, modern art, experimental and materialistic, and hoped thus to satirize the painter of ideas and to strike a blow at the old school. For more than 2 years he had made studies for this purpose, but had not yet found the key note. He had commenced a dozen canvases, but was dissatisfied with all, and felt a certain spite against his two models on account of his unpainted picture. Wherever he saw them, however, he joined them, and the three roamed the streets together, all in a row, compelling the people they met to turn out for them. They learned to know each corner by its odors: the wine shop, the pastry cook's, and the baker's. When they wandered through the wide new streets, la Rue du Pont Neuf and la Rue des Halles, he orated to the gamins on their beauty and magnificence, on the birth of a new era which he felt to be near at hand, an era of originality. But Cadine and Marjolin preferred the provincial quiet of la Rue des Bourdonnais, where they could play marbles on the curbstones without danger of being walked on. They preferred those portions of old Paris which were still left standing, les rues de la Poterie et de la Lingerie, with their swelled front houses and narrow dark shops. They liked to loiter at the windows and adore the sweetmeats, the boxes of prunes and the candies in the confectioners' windows. There was one shop where soap was manufactured, where Marjolin always stopped to catch the fragrance which came from the door as it was opened. Cadine insisted on looking at the barrels of anchovies and capers at a great warehouse; huge jars of pickled cucumbers and olives with their wooden spoons. She liked the smell of pickled salmon, of hams and dried herring, and smacked her lips at the sight of the boxes of sardines. In la Rue Coquillière they caught the smell of truffles, and there Cadine and Marjolin shut their eyes, and pretended they were eating the most delicious things. Claude laughed at them, called them simpletons, and said he should leave them to dine on the smell of truffles. Cadine, when she was alone, did not extend her walks so far. She had a weakness for certain places, for an especial pastry cook who displayed in la Rue Surbigo almond cakes, savarns, babas and eclairs, custards and creams, and looked with longing eyes on the macaroons and madeleines. The bakery, with its clean marble counters, was almost as attractive, and yielding to temptation she would go in and buy a brioche for 2 sous. Another shop opposite the Square des Innocents made her mouth water, and she vowed to herself that the day would come when she would eat her fill of the delicacies there displayed. Cadine also felt a longing for pretty things to wear as well as to eat, and as she walked would select a pale blue or green silk as that which she would like, and in the evening lingered before the jewelers in la Rue Montmartre, whose windows blazed with the white light of silver and the yellow hue of gold. The watches, bracelets, and rings did not tempt her as much as the silver thimbles which covered a globe. She selected, however, some earrings of imitation coral, which she regarded as altogether the most beautiful things there. One morning Claude found her transfixed before the window of a coiffeur in la Rue Saint-Honoré. She was looking, with evident longing, at the display of hair in all hues, from the palest blonde to the densest black, in the midst of which a woman's bust was slowly revolving. The woman wore a scarf of cherry satin fastened by a brass breastpin, and the hair was dressed as a bride's, very high, with orange blossoms. The mouth wore a simple smile, and the eyelashes were stiff and preposterously long, but Cadine was completely fascinated by this beautiful creature. Claude was furious. He shook Cadine, and asked her what she found to admire in that bust, which looked as if it had come from the Morgue. Cadine and Marjolin had made the acquaintance of Léon, the apprentice of the Quenu Gradelle. They saw him as he carried a tray to some customer, select a quiet corner, and there lift the covers and try each dish in succession. They at once felt him to be one of themselves, and Cadine determined to know him and enjoy these delicacies with him on some future occasion. She invited him to a breakfast which she gave in a corner of the market, sheltered from public observation by a rampart of empty baskets. The table was a flat basket turned bottom upwards. They had pears, nuts, cheese and shrimps, fried potatoes and radishes. The cheese came from a fruiterer's in la Rue de la Cossonnerie, and was a present. She had purchased 2 cents worth of fried potatoes on credit; the rest of the feast she had stolen. It was a regal repast, and Leon, not wishing to be outdone, returned the civility by a supper, and gave them cold blood pudding, sausages, pickles, and ham. The charcuterie of the Quenu Gradelle had provided everything. From this time suppers and breakfasts were constantly interchanged. Never were young people happier. Marjolin constantly provided sweet surprises for Cadine in the way of delicacies, which he stole for her delectation. He had become very skilful in this respect, and helped himself like magic as he walked between the stalls. Notwithstanding his success, however, the friteur was beginning to make loud complaints. This friteur whom Cadine patronized had his little stall supported against the side of a tottering wall, held up by moss-covered beams, and Cadine owed him 30 sous, and was quite crushed by the debt. How could she ever pay it? She did not count on Marjolin; she never did. She felt herself compelled to return Leon's politeness, and was quite ashamed that she could never offer him any meat. He had served them an entire ham at a time. He had all the things which the shop could furnish, but no bread, and nothing to drink. Marjolin saw Leon kiss the girl one night, but he only laughed. He was not jealous of her. Claude never assisted at these festivities. He had caught Cadine one day stealing a bunch of beets, and had pulled her ears well. She should not do this, he said, and yet he felt a certain sense of amusement at seeing these happy animals picking up the crumbs of this abundance. Marjolin was in Gavard's employment, and had little to do save to hear his master's interminable tales. While Cadine continued to sell her violets, Marjolin left her very often, to look through the windows at Madame Quenu. He experienced in looking at her a sensation as if he had eaten something that he liked, and he left the window eager to see her again. He dreamed of her every night, and contrived to see her nearly every day, as she had now taken upon herself the task of going to market, and passed Gavard's shop on her way. The truth was, her instinct taught her that she was more likely to induce him to speak openly to her in his own shop than in hers, where he was on his guard; but in his he was quite willing to orate. She determined to discover from him what took place at Monsieur Lebigre's, for in Mademoiselle Saget she did not place unbounded confidence. She was appalled at what Gavard told her, and 2 days after the explanation she had had with Quenu, she came in from market very pale. She made a sign to her husband to follow her into the dining room. She closed the doors, and then turned toward him. "Your brother, then, is determined to send us all to the scaffold, is he? Why do you have any concealments from me?" Quenu swore that he did not know what she meant, and then promised her never to set foot again inside the Cabaret. She shrugged her shoulders. "You will do wisely," she answered, "unless you wish to leave your skin there. Florent will get himself into trouble. I see it. I feel it." Then, after a moment's silence, she added, more calmly, "What a foolish fellow he is! He might live here in the clover if he chose, but no, he must dabble in politics. He will ruin himself, and us too. Quenu, this must end. I told you so, you remember." Quenu caught his breath. He knew what was coming. "He shall eat here no more," she said. "It is enough for him to sleep here. He makes money. Let him buy his own food." Quenu tried to protest, but she closed his lips by exclaiming, "Then choose between him and us. I swear to you that I will take my daughter and go away if he remains. I shall speak the plain truth to you now. He is, in my opinion, a bad man, who has brought only trouble into our home. But I will soon settle it. You must choose between him and me." Quenu was breathless, and she left him and returned to the shop, where she weighed out a half pound of pate de foie with her affable smile. Gavard, in a hot political discussion, to which she had adroitly led up, had said that she would soon see strange things, and made several veiled allusions which disturbed her greatly. Her imagination at once depicted armed police picking up Quenu, Pauline and herself, by the napes of their necks, and incarcerating them in a prison. She was icy in her demeanor that night toward Florent. She did not help him to any dish on the table, and said several times : It is strange how much bread we eat lately." Florent at last understood that he was treated like a poor relation of whom one wishes to get rid. He had worn Quenu's old clothes for the last 2 months, and as Quenu was fat and he thin, the effect of these garments was most remarkable. Lisa also handed him over her husband's old linen. The ragged towels and sheets were sent to his room, and he no longer was treated in other ways with the consideration which had been shown him. Little Pauline made remarks which wounded him, in regard to the shabbiness of his garments. These remarks about the bread were more than he could endure. Quenu did not look up, and pretended not to notice what was going on. Florent, however, did not know how to get away. For a week he tried to find words in which to say that he thought he should prefer to take his meals elsewhere. His gentle nature cherished the illusion that he should wound his brother and sister in law by this proposition. He was unwilling to admit, even to himself, the hostility which Lisa felt toward him, nor did he once think, so great was his unselfishness, of his money, which his sister in law held in her hand. He thought with what remained to him of his salary, and with the proceeds of the lessons he gave one pupil, that he could spend 18 sous for his breakfast and 26 for his dinner. At last, one morning, he said that, as he found it impossible to be punctual at his meals, that he would take them when and where he could. He colored as he said this. La belle Lisa was cold and stately, which troubled him greatly. She had determined not to take the initiative, but to wait until he spoke himself. And now she should get rid of him without any disagreeable scene. But Quenu exclaimed in some agitation : Eat just where you please, my dear fellow. You will remember, however, that it is your own fault if you go. You will dine with us sometimes on Sunday, however." Florent hastily left the room, for his heart was very full, and Lisa, when alone with Quenu, did not venture to reproach him for the weakness of which he had been guilty in this invitation for Sundays. She was victorious, and she drew a long sigh of satisfaction, and wanted to burn some sugar to get rid of the fishy smell which she said haunted her. At the end of a week she was not as well satisfied. She saw Florent very rarely, and she took it into her head that he was manufacturing some infernal machine up in the attic, or arranging some system of signals from his window. Gavard was apparently despondent. He left his shop in Marjolin's care for a day at a time, and fidgeted to and fro. La belle Lisa determined on a master blow. She knew that Florent had asked for a few days' holiday, and proposed to pass them with Claude Lantier at Nanterre with Madame Fran9ois. Lisa went to invite Gavard to dinner, but she could not find him. Marjolin was alone in the shop. Chapter 4 Part 2 of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chickweed for the Little Birds, Part 2. High above his head hung fat geese and dead rabbits, with frightened eyes. Pigeons and ducks, as yet unplucked, were on the counter. 3 superb turkeys, specked with blue, like a chin that has been freshly shaved, lay on their backs, while in plates were the livers, hearts and gizzards, claws, necks and pinions. Marjolin, among all this food, with his smooth, glossy skin, looked as if he too were good to eat. When he saw La belle Lisa, he started from his lounging position. He was always more or less timid in her presence, and stammered, in reply to her question, that he did not know where Monsieur Gavard was. He had been there an hour before, but had gone away, without saying when he would return. She stooped to caress a rabbit in a box, saying as she did so : Do you not think you could find him?" He may be in the poultry rooms in the cellar," answered Marjolin. I will wait for him, then," said Lisa. Or better still, why can't I go down there? I have wanted to go for 5 years, and you will show me the way, will you not?" The youth stammered forth a confused expression of willingness to do anything she desired. but the heavy air of the cellar suffocated La Belle Charcutière. She stood on the steps and looked up at the arched ceiling and at the heavy columns. She hesitated on account of the penetrating odour, the exhalation from living creatures which scorched her throat with their alkalis. "The smell is horrible," she said. "It would not be healthy to live here." "I am perfectly well, madame," said Marjolin, much astonished. "The smell is not so bad, when one is accustomed to it." She followed him, saying that the smell disgusted her with fowls, and she should not want to eat any for 2 months. The poultry houses stood in straight lines, with occasional gas lights between, and the aspect was that of a village at midnight, when all its inhabitants are asleep. At each corner was a long blue board, on which were inscribed the names of the tenants. "Monsieur Gavard is away at the back," said the young man. They turned into a dark corner, but no Gavard was to be seen. "Never mind, madame, I will show you the fowls myself, for I have a key." La belle Lisa followed, and stumbled against him. "If you think," she said, "that I can see anything in this darkness, you are very much mistaken." He did not reply instantly, but at last stammered that there was always a candle inside, that he could light. But he fumbled a long time over the lock. She tried to assist him, and felt his breath hot on her neck. When he lighted the candle, she saw that his hands trembled. "Simpleton!" she cried. "The idea of getting into such a state of excitement because a door can't be opened. I should think you were a nervous girl." Gavard had hired 2 compartments, and made them into one poultry room by taking away the partitions. Turkeys, geese, and ducks were picking in the dung heaps, while on shelves, built in 3 rows, one above another, were boxes with gratings over them containing chickens and rabbits. The place was incredibly dirty and hung with grey spiders' webs. But Lisa was too civil to show her disgust. She looked into the boxes, and compassionated the poor chickens who were shut out from the light of day, and could not even stand and move about. The young man showed her a duck whose leg was broken, and said they should kill him that evening for fear he would die during the night. "But," she said, "when do they eat?" He explained that they did not eat without light, and that he or Gavard was obliged to light a candle, and wait until the creatures had got through their meals. "I like to watch them," he continued. "It is droll to see them fight. Sometimes I shade the light with my hand, and they stand perfectly still, and then put their heads under their wings, as if the sun had set. It is against the regulations to go away and leave a light here. One of the poultry women nearly set the place on fire the other day." "Your poultry require a good deal of waiting on," said Lisa, "if they must have a candle lighted for each meal." As she spoke she passed out of the room, raising her skirts from out of the filth. He blew out the candle and locked the door. She hurried on, not liking to be left with this youth in the darkness. When he joined her, she said: "I am glad to have seen this. There are certainly many odd things under the Halles. I am very much obliged, but I must hurry home now. If Monsieur Gavard comes in, pray tell him that I must speak to him at once." "He is probably at the abattage," answered Marjolin. "Let us go and see." She did not reply. The close air of the place made her very uncomfortable, and it annoyed her to have Marjolin so close to her. He breathed hard, too, as if the air affected him also. She stepped back a little, and motioned to him to precede her. She fancied that her companion guided her in a very roundabout way. When they came out in front of the Underground Railway, he told her that he wanted to show it to her. They stood for a few moments, looking through the beams of the protecting wall. On their way back they found Mother Palette in front of her poultry house, taking the cords off a large basket, from which a furious noise of wings and claws were heard. When she loosened the last knot, the geese within raised the cover with their powerful heads, and escaped, running and flying with loud hisses, which resounded through the arched cellar. Lisa could not help laughing, while the poultry woman swore like a pirate, and succeeded in catching 2, while Marjolin started in pursuit of a third. He was heard running at full speed, laughing and much amused by this unlooked-for frolic. Then there was a sound of a struggle, and he soon returned with the bird. Mother Palette, an old yellow woman, took it, and held it for a moment in the position of the antique Leda. "I don't know, I am sure, what I should have done, Marjolin, if you had not been here. The other day I fought with one, but I had my knife, and cut its throat at last." Marjolin was all out of breath, and Lisa caught a strange light in his eyes, as together they reached the abattage. Generally, he dropped his eyes when she spoke to him. For the first time she realized his superb beauty, his square shoulders, and his bright complexion and blonde hair. She looked at him with the frank admiration which women often fearlessly evince toward very young men. He became once more timid and embarrassed. "You see that Monsieur Gavard is not here," she said, "and I am wasting my time." He explained to her the abatage, showed her the huge blocks of stone lighted by gas. One woman was plucking chickens, which led him to say that they often plucked them alive, because it was so much easier. He told her to take up a handful of the feathers, which were piled up there, and said they were sold at 9 sous the pound. She put her hand into the baskets of down. He called her attention to the water faucets at each pillar, and told her that all spots of blood were washed up every 2 hours by men whose especial duty it was. He added that in great rainstorms the water often invaded these cellars once to the height of 3 centimeters, on which occasion he was obliged to take all his poultry to the upper end. He laughed as he described the fright of the creatures. He finished by showing her the ventilators, which carried off all bad odors. This seemed to her a ridiculous thing to say, so thoroughly was the air impregnated by the ammoniated smell of the guano. Marjolin seemed in a state of suppressed excitement, and was no longer timid. "You are a good boy," said La belle Lisa, "to have shown me all this. When you come to my shop I will give you something." Forgetting his age, and remembering only that she had known him since his babyhood, she took him by the chin as she spoke. If her hand lingered, it was unconsciously, though she was by no means as calm as usual herself. He, at this caress, glanced quickly around, assured himself that no one was near, and caught La belle Lisa by the waist, and threw her into a huge crate of feathers. She, pale and trembling at this brutal attack, sprang up and raised her large round arms, and struck a blow, just such as she had seen struck at the abattoir, fair between the eyes. He fell, and his head struck one of the stones. At this moment a cock crowed loudly. La belle Lisa was chilled through and through. Her lips were white. Over her head she heard the dull roar of the Halles. Through the gratings came the street sounds, and she thought that only the strength of her own arms had saved her. She shook off the feathers that had adhered to her skirts. Fearing to be seen, and without a glance at Marjolin, she hurried to the staircase. Daylight and the fresh air were a great relief. She entered her shop, perfectly calm, and only a little paler than usual. "Where have you been so long?" said Quenu. "Looking for Gavard," she answered quietly. "I could not find him, and we must eat our leg of mutton without him." She filled up several pots with lard, prepared some chops for her friend, Madame Taboureau, whose little servant was waiting. As she broke the bones with her mallet, she thought of Marjolin lying in the cellar, but felt no pang of self-reproach. She had only done her duty. She looked at Quenu. He certainly was very plain, and his skin was very rough, and his chin far from velvety, while the skin and the chin of the other were like down. She said to herself with a sigh that it was a pity for children to grow up so fast. Quenu was struck by her beauty. "You ought to go out oftener," he said. "If you wish, we will go to the theatre sometimes — to the Gaieté, where Madame Taboureau saw that play she liked so much." Lisa smiled and said she would see, and then went out again. Quenu thought she was very good to run after Gavard in that way, but she had only gone up stairs to Florent's room, the key of which hung on a nail in the kitchen. She hoped, as she could not get hold of Gavard, to make some discoveries here. She went about the room, examined the bed, and looked at the mantelshelf. The window was open, and the plants were drinking in the soft air. She could not find the smallest trace of Florent's presence. She was astonished at this. She touched Augustine's dress, still hanging in the corner, and then took a seat at the table, reading a half-finished page, in which the word Revolution occurred several times. She was frightened at this, and opened the drawer, which she saw was full of papers. She sat looking at them, when the bird uttered a long, shrill cry. She started, and realized the ignominy of the act she was about to commit. She closed the drawer. She went to the window, and standing there, said to herself that she would take counsel of the Abbe Roustan, a man of good, sound sense. As she mechanically looked down on the square below, she beheld Cadine weeping in the centre of a crowd, while Florent and Claude were talking earnestly together, a little apart. She hurried downstairs, surprised at their speedy return. Hardly was she established behind her counter than Mademoiselle Saget entered, saying: Come and see poor Marjolin, madame. He was found in the cellar unconscious, and a great gash cut in his head." Lisa hurried across the street. The youth lay with his eyes closed, and his fair hair stained with blood. Some one among the crowd said it was nothing, that it was his own fault, that he was always foolhardy, and jumping over the tables at the abattage. This was one of his favourite amusements, and he had undoubtedly fallen in that way. Mademoiselle Saget pointed to the weeping Cadine. "Probably that little scamp pushed him. They are always in mischief." Marjolin, revived by the fresh air, opened his eyes. He caught sight of Lisa's face bending over him, and smiled faintly. He did not seem to remember anything that had taken place. Lisa said calmly that he ought to be taken at once to the hospital. She would go and see him and carry him some delicacies. He was put on a litter, and Cadine followed it, still with her wicker tray suspended around her neck, and her bunches of violets stuck into the moss, which she watered with her hot tears. As Lisa entered her shop, she heard Claude say to Florent as they were separating: "That boy has spoiled my day, but we did have a good time." Claude and Florent had indeed brought back with them something of the fresh air of the country. That morning, before daybreak, they went to find Madame Fran9ois, who had just sold her last vegetable. They then, the three together, went to the Compas d'Or, in the Rue Montorgueil, for the wagon. This was almost a foretaste of the country. Behind the Restaurant Philippe, whose gorgeous gilding illuminated the entire lower floor, was a regular farmyard, smelling of fresh straw and warm dung. Young chickens and hens picked the soft earth, stalls and sheds of all sorts and sizes were built against the neighboring houses. Balthasar, all harnessed, was eating his oats comfortably under shelter. He was, nevertheless, quite ready to return to Nanterre, but he did not go back unloaded. The market woman had made a bargain with the company, who had contracted to keep the Halles clean. She carried home with her 3 times in the week a load of refuse taken up with a pitchfork from the heap swept together in the centre of the square, which was a valuable addition to her manure heap. Claude and Florent lay on the coarse sheet she spread over these green leaves. Madame Fran9ois took the reins, and Balthasar started forth, his head a little low on the account of the unusual burthen he carried. This visit had been long talked of. The market woman was as gay as a lark. She liked the 2 men, and promised them such a breakfast as they had never eaten in that miserable place, Paris, and they enjoyed the prospect of the long idle day before them. "Are you comfortable?" asked Madame Fran9ois, as she turned into la Rue Pont-Neuf. "Yes, as cozy as 2 peas in a pod," answered Claude, gaily. He lay on his back, watching the stars paling in the sky, and the growing light in the east. They listened to the good woman talking to Balthasar. "Take your ease, old fellow," she said softly. "We are in no such great hurry." They reached the Champs-Elysées, and the painter saw trees on either side, and beyond the green mass of the gardens of the Tuileries. As they passed the Rue du Roule, he looked at the side door of Saint Eustache in the distance. "Do you know," he said suddenly, "that iron is destined to kill stone? It is not by accident that we see Saint Eustache through one of the long avenues of Les Halles. It is a fatality. It is modern art, realism, nature, whatever you may choose to call it, which has grown up in the face of ancient art. You do not agree with me?" As Florent did not speak, he continued: "This church is not a pure architecture. The Moyen Age is dying in it, and the Renaissance is not yet on its feet. But have you noticed the churches which are built in these times? They are like observatories, libraries, hospitals, like anything, in fact, but churches. And it would be difficult to convince me that le bon Dieu looks upon them as suitable. The masons who loved him are dead, and it would be wiser not to erect any more of these ugly constructions. Since the beginning of this century but one original monument has been built, the natural outgrowth of the epoch, and this is the Halles. These markets, I tell you, are a timid revelation of the spirit of the 20th century, and this is why Saint Eustache is nearly obscured. There it stands empty, while the Halles have grown up around it, crowded with life." "Look at Balthasar," said Madame Fran9ois, laughing. "The woman who brought you safely into the world earned her money, for you make even animals listen to you when you speak." The carriage went slowly on. At this early hour the avenue was deserted. There were no rows of chairs on the sidewalk, and the turf lay dark under the trees. At the Rond Point a lady and gentleman on horseback passed, and Florent closed his eyes the better to enjoy the sweetness of the fresh breeze. He was happy in getting away from the Halles, happy to breathe an air uncontaminated by the smell of food. They say," continued Claude, that industry kills poetry, and the fools weep over flowers, as if any one proposed to hurt the flowers. These people fret me to death. I want to answer their moans by a work which they must needs accept as a defiance. It would amuse me to startle these good people a little. Shall I tell you the thing which pleases me best of all I have ever done in my life? It is quite a story. Last year, on Christmas Eve, I was at my Aunt Lisa's, and that goose of a fellow Auguste was dressing the shop windows and the counters. I looked on until I could bear it no longer, and told him I would do it myself. You see, I had all the strong colors I required — the red of the tongues, the yellow of the small hams, blue in the paper, pink in the delicate slices which were cut, green in the carrot and lettuce leaves, and such a black as I could never find on my palette in the blood puddings. The sausages, chitterlings, and breaded pig's feet gave me delicious tones of gray. I made a superb thing of it. I took my dishes, plates, jars and bottles, and massed them together. I arrayed the tongues so that they looked like scarlet flames, and a large truffled turkey lay in the centre. I tell you it was simply superb, and the crowd that gathered before the window thought the same. But Aunt Lisa, when she appeared, was quite shocked, and bade Auguste arrange the window as usual. And, of course, he did not grasp the idea of the reds being brought out by the grays, and of course it was hopeless to try and make him see it. Never mind, it was the best thing I ever did." Claude sank into silence, smiling at his thoughts. The wagon had reached the Arc de Triomphe. The wind blew strongly down the various open avenues around the immense square. Florent leaned out and drank in the breath of the green grass which blew toward him from the fortifications. At the top of la Rue de Longchamp, Madame Fran9ois showed him the place where she had picked him up. He fell into a deep reverie, and as he looked at the market woman, he thought her look of health and benignant sweetness of expression made her more beautiful than Lisa. When they reached Nanterre, the carriage turned to the left and entered a narrow lane, running along the walls, and stopped in an enclosure from which there was no outlet. It was the end of the world, the market woman said. There they were to leave their load of cabbage leaves and greenstuff. Claude and Florent bade the boy who was planting out lettuce to go on with his work, while they, armed with pitchforks, threw out the heap. This amused them, and Claude had a good deal to say about the refuse from the market being sent back again, in the form of new generations of vegetables and fruits. Paris consumed everything, returned everything to the earth, which in due time repaired all damages. There is a cabbage stump which I recognize," said Claude, as he took up the last on his pitchfork. This is the 10th time, at the very least, that it has grown up in that corner by the apricot tree." Florent laughed, but his smiles faded as he walked on. Claude was making a sketch, and Madame Fran9ois was preparing breakfast. This garden was a long, narrow strip, from the extremity of which he could see the low casemates of Mont Valérien, which were divided by row after row of evergreen hedges, from the little garden of Madame Fran9ois. A great peace brooded over the landscape. The May sunshine had brought out insect life, and a gentle humming of bees fell upon the stillness. The garden was laid off in squares, sorrel and spinach, radishes, carrots and beets. Cabbages and potatoes stood in regular lines, while peas and beans were sending out their slender tendrils. Not a weed was to be seen. The ground looked as if it were swept every morning. Borders of thyme put a gray fringe to the two sides of the wide path. Florent enjoyed this breath of thyme, brought out by the hot sun. He loved the country and all growing things. For a year he had seen none, except those torn from the ground. He liked to see the vegetables here, whole and hearty. The cabbages were luxuriant, the carrots were gay, and the salads looked contented and crisp. The markets which he had left behind him he looked back upon as a vast cemetery, where only dead things lay. The noise and the smell of the fish market seemed to him a thing of the past. Yes, Claude was right. The earth was life, the cradle and the health of the world. "Your omelette is ready," cried the market woman from the door. When the three sat round the table, with the sunshine streaming in at the open door, they were all so gay that Madame Fran9ois looked at Florent in astonishment. I declare," she said, you are 10 years younger. Your eyes have a laugh in them that I never saw there before. You ought not to live in a city. Come and live here." But Claude interfered. He said that Paris was superb. He even defended the gutters, although he admitted that he adored the country. In the afternoon, Florent and Madame Fran9ois were alone in a corner of the garden, where a few fruit trees were planted. She was giving him some maternal advice. She asked him what he meant to do with himself, and her questions evidently arose from friendly interest, with no admixture of curiosity. He was deeply touched, for no woman had ever before shown so much interest in him. She reminded him of a healthy out-of-door plant, while Lisa, Claire and La Normande were doubtful, and arranged for sale, so to speak. About 5 o'clock the two men started for Paris. They were going to walk, and Madame Fran9ois went to the end of the lane with them. She there took Florent's hand. Come here," she said, if you are ever in sorrow." For a half hour Florent walked on in silence, feeling that he left health, safety and happiness behind him. The road was white with dust, clouds of which arose each time they brought their feet down. The sun was low, and their shadows stretched far upon the opposite sidewalk. Claude, with swinging arms, took long, regular strides, and looked at their shadows. Then, arousing himself, as if from a dream, he said : Do you know the battle of the Fat and the Lean?" Florent said no, in some surprise, whereupon Claude went off into an enthusiastic praise of this series of engravings. He described certain ones. The fat men, enormously stout, preparing for their evening gourmandizing, while the thin men, bowed by fasting, looked in from the street with covetous eyes; and then again the fat ones, at table, with cheeks stuffed full, dismissing a lean one, who had been audacious enough to enter, and who looked like a needle among bullets. He saw in this the drama of human life, and ended by classifying men into the fat and the lean, natural enemies, where the one devoured the other. You may be sure," he said, that Cain was fat and Abel thin. Ever since the first murder, there has always been a constant battle of the strong against the weak, each swallowing his neighbor, and being swallowed in turn. So look out, my boy. Distrust fat people as a rule." He relapsed into silence, and watched their shadows. We are the thin ones, you see. Tell me, as flat as we are, with no bellies to speak of, ought we to claim much sunshine?" Florent smiled, but Claude was in earnest. You may laugh," he continued, but it is no laughing matter. If I were fat I should paint quietly, have a fine studio, and sell my pictures for their weight in gold. Instead of that I am thin, and when I die, I shall probably be put between 2 leaves of a book, instead of having a coffin bought in which to bury me decently, as would be the case were I double my weight. But you are worse than I. You are really the king of lean men. Do you remember the day you quarreled with the fish women? It was a magnificent sight, their heaving breasts and broad shoulders, in contrast to your meagre form. They acted as I tell you. Their instinct was to drive the thin man from among them, for the fat dislike and distrust the thin. And were I you, I should act on these suggestions. The Quenus are fat. So are the Mehudens. In fact, you are surrounded by fat people. I should get out of it if I were you." And Gavard, Mademoiselle Saget, and your friend Marjolin, what of them?" asked Florent, still smiling. Oh, I will classify all your acquaintances, if you say so. I have had every one of their heads in my portfolio for a long time, with the indication of the order to which they belong. It is a chapter of natural history. Gavard is a fat man, but wishes to be included among the thin. That is quite a common variety. Mademoiselle Saget and Madame Lecoeur are thin, and much to be feared, as they are ready to commit any enormity in order to be enrolled among the fat, while Marjolin, Cadine and La Sarriette are among the fat, but they are, as yet, so young that their worst qualities are not developed. It is worthy of remark that the young belonging to the fat class are altogether charming. Your political acquaintances, of course, are among the thin." The painter rambled on in this way all the way from the Pont de Neuilly to the Arc de Triomphe. But where do you place Madame Fran9ois?" said Florent, finally. Claude was considerably embarrassed by this question. He hesitated. Madame Fran9ois — Madame Fran9ois — no, I do not know just where to place her. She is a good woman, and that is enough." They both laughed. At this moment they stood before the Arc de Triomphe. The sun was so low in the horizon that their colossal shadows fell upon the monument, higher even than the enormous statues, like two dark stains. "See here," cried Claude, as he took his friend's arm. "If we go on like this, when the sun has set our two heads will touch the sky." But Florent laughed no more. Paris had reabsorbed him. That Paris which, ever since his sojourn at Cayenne, he had regarded with terror and distrust. When he reached the Halles, the smells were suffocating, and he bowed his head, ready to take up again the burthen of his nightmare, haunted by a longing for the country and the breath of time. Chapter 5 Part 1 of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Duty before all. Part 1. The next day, about 4:00, Lisa went to church. She had made, in honor of this intention, a very careful toilette. A black silk and a French cashmere shawl. La belle Normande watched her until the door of Saint Eustache closed upon her. Lisa was not religious, and made no pretensions to being so. Said that she wished to do her duty to her neighbors and to herself. But she did not allow any one to speak lightly of religion in her presence, and always silenced Gavard when he wished to narrate some vile stories of priests and nuns. She was politic, and wished to respect every one's scruples. Besides, so far as she knew, priests were worthy of all respect. She knew personally the Abbe Roustan at Saint Eustache, and had the greatest regard for him. She insisted that most people needed the daily guidance of religion. She looked upon it as she did on the police, as necessary to maintain order, and without which no government could possibly stand. When Gavard declared that some day cures would be nowhere, she would shrug her shoulders impatiently. When Lisa therefore went to church, her demeanor was very quiet. She had purchased a beautiful prayer book, which she opened only at the marriage and burial services. She stood and she knelt at the right moments with all due solemnity. In her opinion, it was only right that respectable settled people should have a certain regard for the outward observances of religion. On the day of which we write, the fair charcutière, on entering Saint Eustache, let the inner door, covered with green cloth, slip softly from her hand. She dipped her fingers in the bénitier, and crossed herself correctly. Then, with a soft footfall, she went on to the chapelle of Saint Agnes, where two women, kneeling with their faces in their hands, waited for the third, whose blue dress was seen surging over the threshold of the confessional. Lisa seemed to be annoyed, and she said to a beadle who was passing: "Does the Abbe Roustan confess to-day?" He replied that Monsieur l'Abbe would not be long now, and if she chose to take a chair, her turn would soon come. She thanked him, but did not say that she had not come for confession. She determined to wait, and walked about the church softly, went down to the door, and looked up the center aisle to the altar. The church was nearly empty, but from the confessional came a low whispering. She went toward it, and beheld the blue robe still at the feet of the Abbe Roustan. "Mercy!" she said to herself, "I could tell all my sins in 10 seconds." Back of the great altar, in the shadow of the double rows of pillars, the chapel of the Virgin is always dark and silent. Women are always there, kneeling in prayer. Lisa stood looking about. She was not nervous, but she vaguely wondered why they did not light the lustres. It would be much gayer than those triangular candlesticks which dropped their wax constantly. An old woman was at that moment taking up the large drops with a broad bladed knife. And in this profound silence she heard the roar of the fiacre, rolling through the street behind the red and purple saints on the windows. As she was about to leave the chapel, she saw Claire, the youngest Mehuden, enter. She lighted a candle, and then knelt down behind a pillar, so pale and disheveled that she looked as if she were dead. Believing that no one saw her, she abandoned herself to an agony of prayer and tears. Lisa was utterly amazed. Never had she supposed that one of the Mehudens was religious. Claire, in fact, usually spoke of religion and of priests in a fashion that was enough to make one's hair rise on one's head. What on earth has got into her?" said Lisa, as she went again toward the other end of the church. "Can the creature have poisoned any one of her men?" At last the Abbe emerged from his confessional. He was a handsome man of 40, with a good, kindly face. When he saw Madame Quenu he shook hands with her and called her "dear Madame," led her into the vestry, where he took off his surplice, and then the two came out again, he bareheaded in his soutane, and they walked up and down one of the aisles talking in low voices. The sun was low and shone on the long windows, but the church was gradually going very dark. Lisa explained all her troubles to the Abbe. There was never any question of religion between them. She never went to confession, but she had formed the habit of consulting him on all critical questions. He was always patient with her. He had advised her in regard to her investments, untied the knot of many difficult matters, recommended tradespeople, and, in short, showed himself to be a most useful friend, having an answer ready to all questions, no matter how complicated they might be, without seeking any personal benefit or any glory for religion. A word of thanks and a smile was enough. He always seemed glad to oblige this handsome woman, of whom his housekeeper always spoke with so much respect. On this occasion the matter under discussion was a most delicate one, for he was by no means sure to what extent she was authorized in interfering with her brother-in-law's movements. She asked this question and also several others, among them where she could go with her child in case of absolute danger. She wished to know if she could watch Florent, and examine his papers in order to guard her husband, daughter and herself from the consequences of his imprudence. She did not ask these questions brutally. She weighed each word she uttered, and they were so well chosen that the Abbe was not compelled to enter into any personalities. His answers were somewhat contradictory, but he ended by saying that an honest nature had the right to prevent evil, or rather that it was his duty to prevent evil, even if to do so he were obliged to employ somewhat questionable means. "This is my opinion, dear lady," he said in conclusion. "This question of means is always a most troublesome one, and one which is a great pitfall for careless feet. But I know your honesty. Weigh each one of your acts, and if your conscience is satisfied, go on boldly. Honest natures have the marvelous faculty of putting something of their own honesty into all they touch." And with a sudden change of tone, he added, "Say to Monsieur Quenu that I am glad to hear that he is well, and to dear little Pauline that I am going to see her soon. Au revoir, dear lady. May all go well with you." He returned to the vestry, and Lisa as she went out had the curiosity to see if Claire was still kneeling. But Claire had returned to her carp and her eels, and before the chapel of the Virgin there was nothing but several turned over chairs to indicate that any one had been there. When Lisa crossed the square again, La Normande, who had been watching for her, knew her by the amplitude of her skirts, dark as it had grown. "Well, well," she said, "the creature has been there more than an hour. What now, I wonder?" The next morning Lisa went up to Florent's room. She was quite sure that she should not be disturbed, but was prepared to say, if Florent should chance to come in, that she wanted to measure the bed for new sheets. Taking her seat at the little table, she took out the drawer, emptied it carefully, and as she examined the papers, replaced them just as she found them. She examined the first chapters of the work on Cayenne, then the rough sketches of the proposed changes of the organization of the market. These pages of fine writing did not interest her in the least, and she was about to replace the drawer convinced that it was elsewhere that Florent concealed the evidences of his infamous plots. Suddenly her hand fell on an envelope which contained a photograph of La belle Normande. The photograph was too dark. La Normande stood with her right arm resting on a broken pillar, and she wore all her trinkets, a much trimmed black silk, and an insolent smile. Lisa forgot her brother-in-law and the terrors which had sent her there. She was absorbed in one of those contemplations with which a woman, when not afraid of being seen, examines another woman, her rival, past, present, or to come. She looked at the hair, the nose and the mouth, held the photograph at a distance, and then scrutinized it closely. She turned it over. On the back was written, "Louise to her friend Florent." She was tempted to take possession of this carte, and use it at some future time against her adversary. She decided, however, that this would not do, that it was not right. Besides, could she not always find it where it was? The idea then struck her, that she had not looked at the back of the drawer among Augustine's needles and cottons. Between the prayer book and the book of dreams she found that for which she was looking: the most compromising notes protected simply by a sheet of grey paper. The idea of a rising, of the tearing down of the Empire, advanced one night by Logre, had slowly ripened in Florent's brain. He fancied now that it was his duty, his mission, and the end for which he had been allowed to return from Cayenne. He had formed a plan to induce the Halles to rise in open revolt. As they held the supplies for this great city they had, he felt, the matter in their own hands. Florent was unhappy all day long. His avocations were utterly distasteful to him. He slept but indifferently, and when he returned from the Cabaret late, he had nothing to do but to write and prepare the famous insurrection. He had divided Paris into 20 sections, each having its chief, a sort of general, who had under his orders 20 lieutenants commanding 20 companies. Each week a consultation would be held by these chiefs, each time in a different place. He deemed it advisable, also, that each one of these companies should believe themselves charged with some imaginary mission, which would almost effectually bewilder the police. As to the setting these forces in operation, the means were simple enough. They would simply await the first political excitement after their organization was complete, and then they would take advantage of it. The details of this vague outline Florent worked upon regularly every evening, as if it had been a drama he was writing, and sketched them on scraps of paper which each demonstrated to a keen observer the mingled shrewdness and childishness of their author. When Lisa had looked over these papers, they fell from her trembling hands. She felt as if she dared not touch them any more than she would have handled gunpowder. One note terrified her more than the others. It was a half sheet of paper on which Florent had drawn, with colored crayons, the form of the insignia which should distinguish the chiefs and the lieutenants. This fact, that the generals were to wear red scarfs, brought the danger well home to Lisa. She saw the crowd pass before her shop and fire through her beautiful plate glass windows, shattering her mirrors and her marble counters. Her brother-in-law seemed to have attacked her personally, and by his nefarious projects ruined her happiness. She closed the door, and looked around the room. Could it be possible that she had sheltered this man? That he had slept in this bed, and that these incendiary documents were in the drawer of that innocent-looking table which she had so long used at Uncle Gradelle's before her marriage? She stood motionless, wondering what she had best do. First, it was useless to attempt any drilling of Quenu. He would never do what she wanted, as she wanted him. She almost decided on an explanation with Florent, but she feared that he would simply take himself off, and compromise them as much somewhere else. On the whole, it was best to keep him under her observation. She should know then the first danger, and be able to take the requisite steps to avoid it. When she went into the shop, she found Augustine in a state of great excitement. Pauline had not been seen for an hour. To Lisa's impetuous questions, she could only say: "She was on the sidewalk by the door with a little boy. I was looking at them, but several customers came in, one after another, and I waited upon them, and it was some time before I missed the child." "It was Much, I am sure it was Much," answered the charcutière. "Oh, what a torment he is!" It was Much. Pauline, who wore a new dress that day, wished to show it. So she paraded up and down before the shop with all the tremendous gravity of a neat little girl, who is afraid of getting herself and her fine clothes dirty. Her skirts were very short and stiffly starched, setting out like those of a ballet dancer, showing her well-fitting cotton hose without one wrinkle, and her shining boots, which were as blue as the sky. Her white apron was low in the neck, and displayed her white shoulders and dimpled rosy arms. She wore tiny turquoise earrings, and a blue ribbon in her carefully brushed hair. There was something of her mother's tender sweetness in the child's expression, while her whole air was that of a French doll. Much, over in the market, had seen her. He had just put into the gutter some tiny dead whiting, and as the water bore them away, he declared they were swimming. But, seeing Pauline so fair and fresh, he forgot his fish, and dashed across the gutter, without shoes or stockings, his torn jacket showing his shirt. His mother had absolutely forbidden him ever to play with "that child," whose parents stuffed her until she was ready to burst. But he cared little for this. He stood and looked at Pauline a minute or two, and then went nearer and touched her blue dress. Pauline was flattered, but she frowned and said, pettishly: "Do go away. My mother does not like me to play with you." At this Much laughed immoderately. "Who cares?" he answered promptly, already cherishing in his wicked little head a plan to soil the freshness of Pauline's pretty garments. The child's instinct must have told her this, for she retreated at once. Then he became more gentle. "What a pretty little cross that is on your neck. Is it your mother's?" Pauline tossed her head, and said it was her own. He coaxed her along as far as the corner of la Rue Pirouette. He asked how her skirts could ever have been made so stiff, at which the child colored with pleasure. But she was much annoyed that no one in the street seemed to notice her. "Come along," said Much, but the child refused. He held up a sou, and little Pauline followed it blindly. "What do you like best?" he asked. She did not reply at once, for the truth was that she liked many things. He named over several: molasses, candy, gumballs, powdered sugar. The last made the child hesitate. She could dip her finger into the sugar and suck it. It was awfully good. She was very serious, but suddenly exclaimed: "No, I like cornets best." He took her hand and led her on, without any resistance on her part. They crossed la Rue Rambuteau, following the wide sidewalk until they reached a grocer's in la Rue de la Cossonnerie, which was quite famous for his cornets. Cornets are horns of paper in which confectioners put the debris of their bottles and boxes, broken sugar plums, marron glasses, which have crumbled to pieces, and all such odds and ends. Much did things in very good style. He allowed Pauline to choose her cornet, which was blue to match her dress, and laid down his sou. When Pauline was outside the shop, she opened the paper and poured the contents into the 2 pockets of her apron, and the pockets were so tiny that they bulged out. Then she began to eat slowly and leisurely, wetting her finger to catch the tiniest crumb. This naturally melted the sugar, and soon 2 brown spots disfigured her dainty apron. Much laughed in mischievous glee, and pulling her along, he said: "Come and play, come and play." They entered the square, which was the place where Much had originally intended to take his conquest. He did the honors of the square as if it were his own domain. Never had Pauline been so far from home. The fountain was running, and Jean Gorgeau nymphs bending over their urns gave a touch of grace to the Quartier St. Denis. The children looked at the water falling into the huge basins, and wondered if they could not creep under the evergreens against the railing. Much, who had by this time succeeded in his fell intention of crumpling the beautiful dress in the rear, now proposed that they should throw sand at each other. This proposition delighted Pauline's heart. They threw the sand, which fell down the neck of the little one's dress, and ran down to her shoes and stockings. Much was delighted at seeing the pretty white apron becoming a dirty yellow, but it was still far too clean in his eyes. "I know how to make beautiful gardens," he said. "Gardens?" murmured Pauline, full of admiration. Then, as the police were not to be seen, he dug several holes in the gravel walk. She was on her knees in the middle of the soft earth, and would suddenly throw herself forward with her lovely little arms buried up to the elbows in the sand. He went to look for bits of wood and sprigs of verdure, and finally ventured to break off a branch from a tree. He stripped this branch into small bits, which he planted in the holes dug by Pauline, none of which he declared were deep enough. When at last their garden was made, and she rose to her feet, Much was enchanted, for she was as dirty a little object as was ever seen. Her very hair was filled with sand. "Now we must water them," he exclaimed, clapping his hands. "They won't grow without water, you know." This was the finishing touch. They left the square, scooped up the water from the gutter in their hands, and ran back to water the plants in their garden. Pauline, who was fat and did not know how to run, let all the water drip through her fingers, so that on the 6th journey she looked as if she had been rolled in the gutter. Much thought her prettier when she was dirty than when clean. He made her sit down and look at their garden, which, he declared, was growing. He took her hand and called her his little wife. "You are not sorry you came, are you?" he asked. "I know lots of games, and we will play them all, only you must not say anything about it to mamma. If you do, I will pull your hair whenever I pass your shop." Pauline said yes again, while he, as a last bit of gallantry, filled the 2 pockets of her apron with earth. He gave her a little pinch, out of pure mischief, and she began to cry. Her sweets were gone, her garden was made, and she wished to go home. But Much shook his head, and said he really did not know about that. The little girl began to sob, and he would certainly have beaten her, to compel her to hold her tongue, had not Mademoiselle suddenly appeared on the scene. "Good heavens!" she cried. "Can this be Pauline? Let her alone, you abominable little scamp." The old maid took Pauline by the hand, with many exclamations at the pitiable state of her garments. Much was not in the smallest degree frightened. He followed them, chuckling over the success of his self-appointed task, and declaring vociferously that it was all the child's fault. She had insisted on going with him, and then she had fallen. Mademoiselle Saget was familiar with this square. She often came there and took her seat on one of the benches among the common people. By her side some sallow woman was mending stockings or darning handkerchiefs, while watching her dirty children at play before her. Here she overheard many a bit of gossip that interested her, many a slanderous tale of the people of the Quartier, tales which emanated from the concierge, and which whetted her curiosity to know more. She soon learned who lived on every floor of the houses built on the 3 sides of the square. The Restaurant Barat interested her particularly, with its wine shop and gay awnings. She liked to watch this pasteboard-like temple affixed to a decrepit old house. Behind the shades she knew that good meals were being served all the time. Pauline was now crying bitterly. The old maid placed her on a bench near the gate, and said, "Come now, don't cry any more. The police will come if you do. I will take you home to your mother, and you know that I am your friend." But the child could not restrain herself, and Mademoiselle Saget allowed her to sob until she was tired. The poor little image was indescribable. She had wiped her tears away with her dirty little hands, and she was mud to the roots of her hair. When she was calmed down, the old maid said sweetly, "Your mother is good to you, is she not? She loves you?" "Yes, yes," murmured the child. "And your father is good, too? He never whips you, and he never quarrels with your mamma? What do they say at night when they go to bed?" "I don't know, I am always asleep." "Do they talk about your cousin Florent?" "I don't know." Mademoiselle Saget put on a very severe look, and rose as if to go away. "I am afraid you tell stories. That is very wrong, and if you can't speak the truth, I shall go away and leave you with Much. Much will whip you." Much, who was leaning over the back of the bench, said in his decided tone, "She is a little goose, and she never hears anything. But I know that my good friend Florent turned every color of the rainbow, when my mother told him he could kiss her if he wanted to." Pauline lifted up her voice now in a wail of childish agony. "Hush!" said the old woman, shaking her violently. "I am not going away. I will buy you some sugar, too, if you are quiet. Then you do not like your cousin Florent?" "No. Mamma says he is not good." "There now. You see your mamma did say something." "And one night — I had Monton sleeping with me — one night she said to papa, 'Your brother has escaped from the galleys, only to take us back with him.'" Mademoiselle Saget uttered a sharp exclamation, and started to her feet. A ray of light struck her full in the face. She snatched Pauline's hand and hurried her along, her lips compressed, but a fierce light in her eyes. At the corner of la Rue Pirouette, Much suddenly disappeared, in spite of the reluctance he felt to lose the pleasure of seeing the child, in her muddy stockings and ruined shoes, received by her mother. Lisa was devoured with anxiety. When she saw her little Pauline in this lamentable condition, she was so overwhelmed that she did not think of punishing her. The old woman said in her sharp voice, "It is that vile little Much. I bring her back to you, and you had best be very thankful. I found them under a tree in the square." Lisa could not speak. She did not know where to take hold of the child, whose skin was encrusted with dirt, as was everything she wore. But she was most exasperated by the sand in the apron pockets. She pointed to the door, and said, "Leave the room, you dirty little creature!" Mademoiselle Saget was quite enlivened by this scene, and left the shop in radiant spirits. Her slender feet flew over the pavement. At last she knew the truth, and Florent was in her power. She went to the fruit market. "Have you won a prize in a lottery?" said La Sarriette, gayly. "You seem to be very happy, judging by your smiles." "Ah, my dear, if you only knew!" La Sarriette was charming amid her fruits. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows, and looked like peaches with the down upon them. She had hung cherries on her ears, with a recollection of what she had done as a child. She had been eating berries, and her mouth was stained with their juice. Fruits were piled before her, while at the back of her stall lay melons and cantaloupes. Choice fruits were in baskets, and reminded one of children's glowing faces seen through curtains of leaves. Peaches were especially superb. Apricots were amber tinted, and cherries were full and ripe. Apples and pears were piled high, next transparent prunes, while strawberries exhaled their exquisite perfume, the wood strawberries particularly. Raspberries added another odor to these, while baskets of grapes, large, heavy clusters of grapes, hung over the side of the baskets, and let their seeds, browned and ripened by the warm kisses of the sun, fall slowly one by one. La Sarriette lived here as in an orchard, intoxicated by odors. As the warm sun brought out the musky odors of the melons, La Sarriette would loosen her fichu, and let more of her satiny throat be seen. Next her was an old woman who sold at her stall withered apples, pears which hung like pendulous breasts, and apricots that had a weird, sickly look, sulphur color speckled with red. But La Sarriette's peaches were like her cheeks and the corners of her mouth; her cherries like her lips. She wanted to show Mademoiselle Saget some wonderful plums that had just come in, but the old woman said: "No, I have no time now. I must see Madame Lecoeur. I have strange things to tell her. Come if you choose." La Sarriette could not resist the temptation. Monsieur Jules was sitting near by. "Take care of my stall for a little while, will you?" she said. "I will be back presently." He called out after her as she turned the corner: "No, Lisette, I am going away. I do not choose to wait an hour, as I did the other day. Your prunes give me the headache." And he walked off with his hands in his pocket, leaving the stall to take care of itself. The two women were by this time out of sight and out of hearing. They were told that Madame Lecoeur was in the cellar, and La Sarriette went down to find her, leaving her companion among the cheeses. The cellar was very dark, for the gas lights were few and far between, and burned but dimly in the bad air. Madame Lecoeur was at work on her butter at one of the tables near the iron gratings on la Rue Berger, through which came a pale daylight. The tables were constantly washed by floods from the faucets, and were as white as snow. Women were working over their butter. They took samples of different qualities, mixed them, corrected the flavor of one by adding more of another, just as is done with wines. They kneaded the mass before them with all their strength, and squeezed out every drop of buttermilk. "Mademoiselle Saget wishes to see you, aunt," said La Sarriette. Madame Lecoeur stopped, straightened her cap with her buttery fingers, regardless of spots. "I have nearly done," she answered. "Tell her to wait." "She has something very interesting to tell you." "One moment," was the reply. She had plunged in her arms again. The butter came up to her elbows. It had been previously softened in tepid water, and oiled her parchment-like skin, from which the purple veins started out like whipcords. La Sarriette was disgusted by these ugly arms at work in this yellow mass. But she remembered that she had worked there many a long afternoon, and that this had been her pâté d'amande which had preserved the beauty of her pretty little hands. "I don't think your butter will be very good, auntie. I can smell it here." "To be sure you can," answered Madame Lecoeur, briskly, "but it can't be helped. There are always people who are on the look out for a bargain." La Sarriette thought she would not care to eat any of this butter. She looked into a little jar, which was full of a sort of red dye. "Your rancourt is too light." Rancourt is a preparation intended to give the butter a tempting hue. The butter makers religiously preserve the secret of its manufacture. It is, in reality, composed of anota seed, with an addition sometimes of carrots, and a decoction of marigold flowers. "Come, do come," said the young woman, impatiently. "Mademoiselle Saget is in a hurry. She has heard something important about Uncle Gavard." Madame Lecoeur wiped her arms hastily, and followed her niece up the stairs, saying anxiously: "Do you think she can have gone?" But she was comforted by seeing Mademoiselle Saget standing among the cheeses. The three women sat down close together. Mademoiselle Saget did not speak for 2 good minutes, and then she said, slowly: "Do you wish to know where Florent comes from, and who he is?" No one spoke. "Very well. He comes from the galleys." CHAPTER VI. Part II of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. This recording is in the public domain. Duty before all. Part II. The smell of cheese filled the air. Cheese from Brittany and from Normandy, done up in cloths. By the side of prints of butter was a Chester and a Gruyere, the first a bright gold color, and the latter looking like a gigantic wheel. Parmesan and Brie were on plates, a Roquefort near by. Tiny cheeses of goat's milk were not especially tempting. "Yes," repeated the old maid, "he comes from the galleys. These Quenu Gradelles need not be so fine." But Madame Lecoeur and La Sarriette uttered exclamations of astonishment. It was impossible. What had he done? Who would have imagined that Madame Quenu, proud as she was, would have chosen such a lover? "You are all out," cried the old maid, impatiently. "Listen to me. I knew that I had seen the fellow somewhere." She told them Florent's story. She recalled the vague reports which had once been current of a nephew of old Gradelle's having been sent to Cayenne for having killed a half-dozen soldiers at a barricade. She had seen him more than once herself, and this was the very man. She lamented that she was losing her memory. She wept over the loss like a student who sees the wind carry off the notes amassed in a lifetime of labor. "6 soldiers," murmured La Sarriette. "He must be as strong as a lion." "And I dare say he has killed as many more since," added Mademoiselle Saget. "I should not like to meet him in the dark." "But," said Madame Lecoeur, "if he is big Lisa's brother in law, he is not her lover." They all looked at each other, and then the old maid said primly: "I really don't see why not." "Except," interposed La Sarriette, "that you say he is the lover of the 2 Mehudens." "Certainly he is. But I don't care whose lover he is, after all. It is all one to me. But he is a rascal." "Of course he is. A thorough rascal," echoed the others. They then began to depict all sorts of catastrophes which would be likely to overtake the fair Lisa. This brother in law would certainly work her some evil, and then, why was he at the Halles? He must be projecting some terrible plot. They decided that new locks should be placed on the poultry sellers, while La Sarriette reminded her aunt that only the week before some one had stolen a basket of peaches. But Mademoiselle Saget informed them loftily that the Reds never did such things as that. They would not condescend to touch a basket of peaches, but they would pillage and burn. Madame Lecoeur turned pale. She saw the Halles in flames, and Florent and his associates bursting out on the devoted city. "And he shares with Quenu old Gradelle's fortune," said Mademoiselle Saget. "I should not think they would like his appearing among them in this way." She then went on to describe Lisa's finding this money, and told the precise sum, which neither Quenu nor his wife had confided to any one. It was clear that Florent had not received his portion, or he would be better dressed. The three women rolled the sweet morsel under their tongues, but finally decided it were best not to attack La belle Lisa, but turned their attention to Florent himself. "I have seen Mademoiselle L6once," said the old maid, with a significant glance. The 2 others were very attentive. Madame L6once was Gavard's concierge. He lived in an old house which was occupied in the lower story by an importer of lemons and oranges. Madame L6once kept house, and carried the keys, and made tisane for the old gentleman when he was ill. She was a cold, severe-looking woman between 50 and 60, speaking very slowly, and extremely aggrieved because Gavard had kissed her on one occasion. Mademoiselle Saget took coffee with her every Wednesday evening, and the two talked incessantly of the worthy poultry merchant. They were both very fond of him, and wished him to be happy. Yes, I saw Madame L4once," repeated the old maid. I saw her last evening. She was in great trouble. It seems that Monsieur Gavard never goes home until after 1 o'clock. She had some hot soup ready for him Sunday night." She knows what she is about," said Madame Lecoeur, bitterly. Mademoiselle Saget thought she ought to protect her friend. Not at all. You are quite mistaken. Madame L4once is above her position. Had she chosen to feather her nest there, she could have done so long ago. He trusts everything to her, and that is why I wish to speak to you, but you must remember that I speak in confidence." They swore never to open their lips, and she continued. Monsieur Gavard has bought a pistol, and keeps it on a table at the side of his bed. And this is not all. His money," gasped Madame Lecoeur, "is all in his wardrobe. He has sold out all his securities and keeps gold on hand." "Gold?" interrupted La Sarriette. "Yes, a great pile of gold. Madame L4once told me that he opened the wardrobe one day in her presence, and that it hurt her eyes, it was so bright." The eyes of the three women were distended as if they saw the gold before them. "I wish my uncle would give it to me, all this beautiful gold," said La Sarriette, gayly. "Jules and I would have a very good time." Madame Lecoeur had little to say. The thought of this gold crushed her to the earth. "If I were you," said Mademoiselle Saget, addressing her, "I should watch over my own interests. This pistol shows that Monsieur Gavard has bad advisers." They all three fell once more on Florent. They pulled him deliberately to pieces. They swore never to open their mouths, not out of regard to Florent, but to that worthy Monsieur Gavard. As they were about to separate, the butter merchant said : "Do you think we can trust Madame L4once?" "You ask me too much," answered the old woman. "I think her a very honest woman, but I by no means answer for her. You must judge for yourselves." The smell of the cheeses grew stronger and stronger, and yet it seemed as if the stench from the words uttered by the venomous tongues of these women was worse than all. "I thank you sincerely," said the market woman, "and if I am ever rich I will show my gratitude with more than words." But Mademoiselle Saget still lingered. She took up a tiny cheese, turned it over, and laid it down again. Then she asked the price. "For me," she added in an insinuating tone. "To you, nothing," answered Madame Lecoeur. "I give it to you." And she added, with a sigh, "If I were only rich." The cheese quickly disappeared in the basket. The butter merchant went down to the cellar, and the old woman walked on with La Sarriette to her stall. "It smells nicer here than at your aunt's place," said Mademoiselle Saget. "I really felt sick there. But here everything is as sweet as yourself, my beauty." La Sarriette laughed. She liked compliments, and said, as she sold some plums to a lady, that they were like sugar. "I should like to buy some, too," said the old maid, when the lady had gone, "only I want so few. You see, one lone woman —" "Take a handful," cried the pretty brunette. "It won't ruin me. Send Jules here, will you, if you see him? He is probably smoking his cigar on the first bench to the right, as you go out." Mademoiselle Saget lengthened her fingers to take up a handful of plums, which she popped into her basket with the little cheese. She pretended that she was about to leave the Halles, but she lingered still, not being quite content with her dinner of cheese and plums. She returned to the butter market, behind which were the stalls of cooked meats. Each morning small, close wagons, like boxes of zinc, with trays and perforated sides, stopped at the doors of restaurants, and at the Minister's and Ambassador's, where the cooks sold the debris from the kitchen. All this was sorted in the cellars at the market, and as early as 9 o'clock the plates were displayed at 3 and 5 sous — bits of meat, a wing of a bird, heads or tails of fish, vegetables and ham. Other plates were devoted to the desserts — cakes a trifle broken, and bonbons which were almost whole. Hungry-looking women, clerks and boys stood at these stalls, among which Mademoiselle Saget quietly slipped. She especially affected one woman who pretended that all she sold came from the Tuileries, which was some consolation to the pride of the little old woman as she ate her slice of cold mutton. Next to her, on this occasion, stood a tall old man who was buying a plate of fish and meat mixed. Mademoiselle Saget had her eyes on some fried white bait for 3 sous. She bargained the woman down, and getting it for 2 sous, put it into her basket. The first movement of each purchaser at these stalls was to smell of the dishes. The odor about the place was not inviting, as it suggested dirty dishwater and grease. "Come and see me to morrow," said the woman. "There is to be a great dinner at the Tuileries to night, and I will put aside something nice for you." Mademoiselle Saget promised to come, and as she turned away she saw Gavard, who had heard. She turned very red, but pretended not to see him, as she drew her shawl close about her thin shoulders, and went away. He followed her a short distance, saying to himself that "the wickedness of this magpie did not astonish him if she ate the things which were cooked at the Tuileries." The next day a vague rumor began to circulate in the Halles. Mademoiselle Saget showed her own peculiar skill. She allowed Mademoiselle Lecoeur and La Sarriette to say what they pleased, while she held her tongue. The stories they set in circulation were most extraordinary, beginning at first with a few words, expanding later, until Florent had killed 10 gendarmes at the barricades. He had returned to France on a piratical craft, and ever since his arrival had been busy with new plots. When the imagination of these women was let loose, they soon organized a band of smugglers and thieves, who devastated Paris in the most systematic manner. They had a great deal to say about the inheritance which the Quenu Gradelles had appropriated. The general opinion was, that Florent had returned to obtain his rights, and that he was only awaiting a good opportunity to pocket the whole. Some day the Quenu Gradelles would be found dead in their beds, for there were terrible quarrels every day there now. When these stories reached La belle Normande, she shrugged her shoulders and laughed. "You are ridiculous," she said. "The dear man is as gentle as a lamb." She had just refused to marry Monsieur Lebigre, who had offered himself in due form, after innumerable little attentions. Every Sunday for 2 months he sent a bottle of liqueur to the Mahoudens. It was Rose who brought it with her submissive air, and delivered it to La Normande with a complimentary message, which she repeated accurately, apparently without being in the least annoyed by this strange commission. When Monsieur Lebigre was dismissed, he sent Rose the next Sunday with 2 bottles of champagne and a huge bouquet, which seemed to indicate that he had not lost all hope. Rose walked up to the pretty fish woman and recited, without a pause, this madrigal from the wine merchant. "Monsieur Lebigre begs you to drink this to his health, which has been much shaken by what you know of. He hopes that you will be kind enough to cure him some day by being as beautiful and sweet as these bowers." La Normande was much amused. She asked many questions of the woman about her master. She asked if he wore suspenders, and if he snored at night, and then told her to take away the champagne and the bouquet. "Tell your master he must send me nothing more. You are a very obliging little woman, I am sure. He told me to come," answered Rose plaintively, "and I think you are doing very wrong to treat him so cruelly. He is a very handsome man." La Normande was entirely carried away by Florent's quiet consistency of character. She sat and listened to the instruction he gave to Much night after night, and made up her mind that she would marry this man who was so kind to her boy. She would keep her stall in the market, and he would be promoted to some higher position. But this dream received no encouragement from anything in the manner of the Professor toward her. He kept her at a distance when she was quite ready to fall into his arms. Florent might, perhaps, have yielded to her charms, but for his attachment to little Much. The idea, too, of a mistress in the same house with her mother and sister revolted him. La Normande learned the history of the man she loved with no small surprise, for never had he made the smallest allusion to it. She insisted on his talking to her now, and asked if he did not fear that the police would find him. He reassured her, saying that it was too old a story, and that they would not trouble themselves. One evening he told her about the woman on the Boulevard Montmartre, the lady in the rose-colored bonnet, and of the breast, pierced through all the soft muslins and laces whose blood had drenched his hands. The thought of her had haunted him all these years. She had gone with him to Guyana, and he had come back to France with the bewildered idea that he should find her still lying on the sidewalk. Never, to this day, did he see a rose-colored bonnet and a shawl falling from the shoulders, without a sick feeling at his heart. When he closed his eyes he could see her coming toward him with her sad, affrighted eyes and white lips. He had never heard her name, and yet she was his model of all that was pure and good. It seemed to him that had he met her a few moments earlier she would have gladdened his whole life. No, he would have no other wife. He would never marry. He did not say this, but his voice shook, the feminine instinct of La Normande grasped his meaning, and she became wildly jealous of the dead woman. "It was a great pity you saw her," she said maliciously, "because she could not have been very beautiful by that time." Florent turned pale. He never forgave La belle Normande for this brutality, which, forevermore, compelled him to associate the idea of a charnel house with that pale face framed in rose-colored silk. By this time La belle Normande began to see that she was mistaken in thinking she had stolen a lover from Lisa. This diminished her triumph so much, that her love for Florent lessened considerably in the next week. But she was comforted by hearing about the fortune which La belle Lisa was keeping from her brother-in-law. When Florent next came, as he sat writing copies, she said to him: "What a strange idea that was of your uncle's to put his money in a salting barrel. 85,000 francs is a very nice sum, but I dare say the Quenus lied and there was twice as much. If I were you I would insist on my share at once." "I don't want it," answered Florent. "I have no use for it." This was too much for her. She burst forth: "Don't you understand that these people are cheating you? Lisa passes over to you her husband's old linen and old clothes. I do not say this to wound you, but every one sees it. You are wearing pantaloons that we have all seen on your brother for the last 3 years. I should throw these old rags in their faces and ask for my money. 42,000 francs, is it not? Very well, then. I would not go out of the shop until I had them." In vain did Florent explain that his sister-in-law had offered him his share, and that he could have it whenever he pleased. He entered into a lengthy explanation in order to convince her of Quenu's honesty. "I know all about their honesty," she exclaimed. "Fat Lisa folds it up and packs it away in her wardrobe so that she may not wear it out. But my poor friend, you see no further than a child of 5 years old. She could pay you your money with one hand and take it away with the other. I say you ought to insist on your rights. I wish you would let me go and have it out with them." "No, no," exclaimed Florent, quite horrified. "I will see about it myself soon." She doubted the truth of what he said, and told him that he was altogether too gentle. She determined to keep him up to the mark, and when she was his wife she would soon settle with Lisa. She lay in her bed at night building all sorts of plans. She saw herself going into the shop and making a terrible scene just when it was crowded. She found such infinite delight in this project that she would have married Florent if for no other reason than to claim this money. Old Mother Mehuden, who was utterly exasperated at Monsieur Lebigre's dismissal, called her daughter an idiot, and declared that the skeleton, the graceful name she gave to Florent, had bewitched her by some nasty drug. When she heard the story of Cayenne, she was absolutely horrible in her rage, at the same time declaring that it was no more than she expected. She called him all sorts of names, and locked up all her drawers as soon as he entered the room in the most ostentatious way. One day she had a terrible quarrel with her eldest daughter, and ended by saying: "Look out! Do not go too far, or I will certainly go to the Prefect and denounce this man." "You will denounce him?" repeated La Normande, trembling all over with terror and indignation. "Do not think of such a thing. If you were not my mother—" Claire, who was present, began to laugh nervously. For some time she had been very quiet and gloomy, moving about as if in a dream, with reddened eyes and a pale face. "If she were not your mother," interrupted Claire, "you would beat her, I suppose you mean? Very well, beat me then, as I am your only sister, for I intend to save my mother the trouble, by going myself to the Prefect." And as La Normande fairly choked, she added in a strange tone: "And when I have done it, I will throw myself into the Seine on my way home." Tears streamed from her eyes, and she rushed from the room. They heard her close her own door violently. Mother Mehuden said no more about denouncing Florent. The rivalry between La belle Normande and La belle Lisa assumed a more formidable character. In the afternoon, when the awning of gray striped with pink was dropped, the fish woman said aloud, with a sneer, that she was hiding herself. The shade in the window also exasperated her. It represented a glade in a forest, where gentlemen in black coats, and ladies in full ball costume, were eating a red pate as big as themselves. La belle Lisa was not afraid, however, and as soon as the sun was gone, the shade was drawn up, and she was seen at her counter, knitting and calmly contemplating the square, crowded with vagabonds lying under the trees, and porters smoking their pipes sat on the benches. At the ends of the sidewalk, 2 advertising columns were filled with gay colored theatrical advertisements. She glanced from time to time at La belle Normande while pretending to follow the carriages. Sometimes she leaned a little forward to look at the omnibus, running from the Bastille to la Place Wagram, but it was merely to see the fishwoman more distinctly. La belle Normande was now avenging herself for the dropped shade, by putting over her head and on her wares large sheets of brown paper, on the pretext of protecting herself from the setting sun. But La belle Lisa triumphed inasmuch as La Normande's great ambition was to do things in good style, and nothing humiliated her more than to hear the good manners of her rival praised. Mother Mehuden had detected this weakness in her daughter and attacked her there. "I saw Madame Quenu at her door to night," she would say. "It is amazing how that woman is preserved. She is always so well dressed, with the air of a lady. It is the counter, after all. Nothing shows off a woman like that." This was a direct allusion to Monsieur Lebigre's proposition. La belle Normande did not answer for a moment. She was thinking of herself on the other corner of la Rue Pirouette, a pendant to La belle Lisa, at the wine merchant's counter. Her affection for Florent received a severe shock. Florent was very difficult to defend just now, for the whole Quartier had turned upon him. Each individual behaved as if he had a personal interest in exterminating him. One declared that Florent had been seen trying to set a fire in the cellars under the markets, and this foolish tale was only one among many. The fish market was the last to yield to this infection. There Florent was liked by the fish women. They stood up for him for some time, but constantly influenced by the butter and cheese women, they yielded at last. Then recommenced the old struggle of the fat against the lean. Mademoiselle Saget's black hat was to be seen at all hours and in all places. Her small, pale face seemed to multiply. She had sworn to avenge herself on the society which assembled nightly in the private room at the Cabaret. She accused these gentlemen of laughing at her for buying broken victuals. The truth was that Gavard one evening had incidentally mentioned that the dried up old maid, who was always spying about, ate the trash that the Bonapartists threw away. These slices of meat, gathered up from the Emperor's kitchen, were to him the personification of all the disorder and corruption of the government, and from this time it was a great joke at the Cabaret to talk of taking Mademoiselle Saget up by the tongs. She was regarded as some vile beast who ate the stuff that a properly educated dog would have rejected. Clemence and Gavard repeated this very poor joke in the market, so that the little old maid was seriously injured by it. When she hung around a stall, with the expectation of some little gift, she would be told, with a coarse laugh, to go to the Tuileries woman, and buy a plate of broken victuals. She fairly wept with mortification, and said to La Sarriette and to Madame Lecoeur that she would certainly have her revenge on Gavard. They made no reply, hoping that she would soon calm down. Gavard, however, was really compromising himself. Ever since the conspiracy was well started, he had carried his revolver in his pocket, a revolver which he had purchased at the best place in Paris, with many precautions and a great air of mystery. The next day he showed it to half the women in the poultry market, binding them to secrecy. This pistol gave him great importance in their eyes, and placed him definitely in the category of dangerous men. He would sometimes pull it out, and show the shining trigger to several women at his stall, begging them all to stand before him that he might not be seen by other people. Then he would take aim at a goose or a turkey, suspended from above, and was delighted at the terror of the women, whom he would soothe by telling that it was not loaded. Then he would pull out a box of cartridges and display those. After they had been sufficiently admired, he would put away his armory, and with folded arms orate for an hour. "A man with that thing," he would say loftily, "is twice a man. Sundays I go with a friend to the Plaine St. Denis. Of course, you understand that I would not tell everybody that I took this with me. We take aim at a tree, and bless your little hearts, I hit it each time I fire. One of these days you will hear strange stories about Anatole." It was his revolver which he called Anatole. At the end of a week every one in the market knew the pistol and the cartridges. He was too rich and too stout to be included in the distrust and hatred they felt for Florent, but the esteem with which he was formerly regarded was greatly lessened, and timid persons became afraid of him. "It is very imprudent to carry arms about one," said Mademoiselle Saget sententiously. "Some accident will certainly happen." Ever since Florent had given up taking his meals at his brother's, he almost lived at the Cabaret, and the private room was regarded much as if it were his own. An old desk was given up to him, in which he kept his books and papers. Monsieur Lebigre even kindly added a table, on which he said Florent could sleep if it were necessary. He showed, in fact, so much kind cordiality, that Florent was quite touched. Logre was very kind also, and it was to him that Florent confided every detail of the plot as it gradually ripened, and of which Florent continued to be the head. He was at this time perfectly happy. He no longer walked on common earth. He moved as if on air. He had the credulity of a child, and the confidence of a hero. His enthusiasm became intense, and he spoke of the coming struggle as of a great fete, to which all brave men would be bidden. While he talked, Gavard played with his pistol, and Charvet grew more and more bitter, as he was by no means pleased with the prominent position assumed by his rival. He was gradually becoming disgusted with politics, and one evening, coming into the Cabaret, rather earlier than usual, he found only Monsieur Logre and Lebigre there. He opened his heart to them. "He is a fellow," he said, "who literally has no notion whatever of politics. He would have done very well as a professor of writing in a young ladies' boarding school. It would be a misfortune to us, rather than a blessing, if he should succeed, for everything would be turned upside down. These humanitarians and half-way poets do not amount to much, except in the way of talk. He will not succeed, but he will get himself locked up, as you will see." His two listeners did not reply. They wished him to continue. "He would have been arrested long ago," resumed Charvet, "if he were half as dangerous as he would have us believe. The police knew he was here, the very first day he set foot in Paris. If they did not interfere with him, it was simply because he was too insignificant to give them any anxiety." Logre started. "Now," resumed Charvet, "it is different with me. For 15 years I have had half a dozen spies at my heels, who will have me arrested whenever the Prefect has need of me." "Yes, certainly," answered Lebigre mechanically. He rarely spoke, and was now paler than usual, as he glanced stealthily at Logre. "If you take my advice," added Charvet, "you will put an end to this sort of thing going on here, or your establishment will be so compromised that it will be closed by the Government." Logre smiled. This was not the first time that Charvet had talked in this way. He wished to frighten them and induce them to break with Florent through their fears. But he found them always undisturbed by anything he could say. He was no less regular in his appearance at the Cabaret after this explosion. Clemence was always with him. She had lost her clerkship at the market. "This Monsieur Manory and I have not the same political opinions," said the brunette, as she carelessly twisted a cigarette. "That is all there is to be said about it. Manory is ready to lick the Emperor's boots." The truth was that she had amused herself one morning in placing against the long list of sales a series of caricatures, and the names of ladies and gentlemen best known at court. Manory had nearly died of horror. Gavard laughed whenever he thought of it. "You ought to have been a man," he said, slapping her shoulder. Clemence had adopted a new way of making her grog. She first filled the glass with boiling water, which she sweetened, and then poured the rum drop by drop on the slice of lemon floating on the top. She then lighted this rum and watched it burn, the flames of the alcohol imparting a green tinge to her face. But after she lost her position at market, she could not indulge in this extravagance. She lived on the proceeds of some lessons that she gave in la Rue Meromesnil. The evenings in the little room were less noisy than they had been. Charvet rarely spoke, but glared in silence at his rival. The remembrance that he had reigned there before the other's arrival gnawed his heart. He continued to haunt the place because he was homesick elsewhere. He recalled the days when he had compelled these men to think on all precisely as he bade them. The thing that enraged him was that he had been dispossessed so gradually that he had not seen it himself. He did not explain this by admitting Florent's superiority. He would simply say with uplifted brows, "The fellow talks like a curé," while the others drank in his words. Charvet pretended not to be able to find a nail on which to hang his hat, so crowded was the small room with Florent's clothing. He even made a formal complaint to the proprietor, and asked if the room was the exclusive property of any single member of the society. This invasion of his rights was the coup de grâce. Men were brutes, and he despised all humanity, as he noticed the way in which Logre and Lebigre hung on Florent's words. He was exasperated by Gavard's revolver, and thought Robine, who never spoke, the most sensible man of the lot, while Lacaille and Alexandre only confirmed him in the idea that the people were stupid, and that they needed a revolutionary dictatorship for at least 10 years before they could govern themselves. Logre declared, about this time, that the organization of the sections was nearly completed, and Florent began to distribute the rolls. After an animated discussion one night, where he felt himself to be in the background, Charvet rose and took his hat, saying, "Good night. Amuse yourselves by all means, but I don't propose to work to gratify the ambition of any man." Clémence wrapped her shawl about her, and added, coldly, "The plan is simply impracticable." Chapter 5. Part 3 of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. This recording is in the public domain. Duty before all. Part 3. And as Robine looked after them, Charvet stopped and asked if he would not go with him. But Robine, having his glass half full of beer, contented himself with shaking hands with the pair, who never came again. Lacaille said some days after this that he had seen them from the street in a brewery in la Rue Serpente, gesticulating and talking earnestly. Florent could never indoctrinate Claude, though he took him more than once to Lebigre's, where the artist spent his whole evening in drawing caricatures. He said to Florent as they walked home together, "The truth is, my dear fellow, I am not in the least interested in politics. But I want to go there again with you, to make 2 or 3 sketches, to add to those I drew while you were discussing. By the way, what were you discussing? The question of the 2 chambers, was it not? I could paint a picture from these sketches, my boy, which would be the success of the Salon." Florent was indignant at this indifference, and reproached the painter with his lack of patriotism. Claude shook his head. "You are right, very likely. I do not say that you are not. I cannot even answer you, you see. I only know that France does not need me, and that — will you allow me to be frank? Well, then, the reason I like you is, because you seem to me to be dabbling in politics as I dabble in art. It is only dabbling, my dear fellow." Florent protested. "You are an artist in your own way. You only dream politics, and I am willing to wager that you spend half your time up here gazing at the stars, counting them as the votes of the world you can't see. You are more of a poet than a politician, and that is the truth." He then went on to say that he was tired of politics, because he had heard so much of them in the various wine shops and cafes, particularly of one in the house occupied by La Sarriette, which was the favorite place of the youth of the Halles. There Monsieur Jules reigned triumphant. He read the journals, and knew all that was going on at the theatres. He adored politics. His ideal was Morny, whom he called thus abruptly. He read the reports of the Corps Legislatif, and laughed vociferously at every word uttered by Morny, and he went on to say that the lower classes detested the Emperor, merely because the Emperor wished nice people to be happy. "I have been to this café often," said Claude, "and they are funny enough when they, with pipes in their mouths, talk of the balls at court, exactly as if they had been invited.
You live in a nice set of people, certainly," said Florent, smiling.
The painter raised his eyebrows. You need not be troubled, they do me no harm. I like to see these women of the people in this way. I don't want a wife, though. One would be sorely in my way. Good night, and sleep well. When you are minister, I will give you my ideas for the embellishment of Paris." Florent was obliged to relinquish all hope of a convert here. This he regretted, for in spite of his fanatical blindness and devotion to his theories, he had begun to realize the hostility around him, which seemed to increase hourly. Even at the Mehudens his welcome was less cordial. The old woman laughed at him covertly, Much did not obey him, and La Normande was out of patience with him, for she had, as yet, found no way of arousing him from his coldness. She had said to him more than once that he behaved as if he were disgusted with her, and she would push back her chair and go to the other end of the table. Auguste's friendship had likewise vanished. He no longer came to his room when he went up-stairs at night. He was really terrified by the reports he heard of this strange man, with whom he had been shut up for hours at a time. Augustine implored him never to be guilty of a like imprudence. Lisa vexed him, moreover, by telling them that they could not be married as long as Florent remained there, as she had no other room to offer them. Auguste at once determined that the convict must be gotten rid of, and at each noise he heard in the night he hugged himself with joy, thinking that the police had come at last to arrest Florent. Below stairs, at the Quenu Gradelles', this subject was never touched upon. Quenu was a little saddened by the coolness between his wife and his brother, but he consoled himself by paying more attention to the salting of his lard and to the seasoning of his sausages. He sunned himself occasionally on his threshold without the smallest idea of the gossip his appearance aroused. He was much pitied, some of the neighbors declaring that he had grown thin, though in truth he had never been so stout in his life, while others said that he ought to be ashamed to look so well when his brother was such a disgrace to him. Quenu, they said, like most deceived husbands, was the last to know the truth, and was as cheerful as usual when he chatted with some neighbor on the sidewalk. The neighbor, however, presented as melancholy and sympathetic a countenance as if all the pigs in France had been suddenly afflicted with the jaundice. "What on earth is the matter?" he said one day to Lisa. "These people all look at me as if they were about to bury me. Do I look ill?" She reassured him, telling him that he looked as fresh as a rose, for he was terribly afraid of illness, sighing and groaning if he suffered from the smallest indisposition. But the truth was, the charcuterie had lost its gaiety to a very great extent. Claude came in one day and said to his aunt that it looked far less cheerful than it did. The customers all asked for their half-pound of lard or 10 cents worth of pork, with lowered voices, as if in a sick room. Lisa was as dignified as ever. Her long white aprons were more glossy and stiffer than of yore. Her handsome, well-kept hands were surmounted by deeper linen cuffs, and her face, with its sad, subdued expression, seemed to say that she was enduring the most unmerited suffering. Marjolin had left the hospital, as well physically as ever, but he had become nearly an idiot. His fall had affected his brain and left him an absolute brute. He was like a child of 5 years of age who had attained a gigantic growth. He laughed, found it difficult to pronounce certain words, and obeyed Cadine implicitly, except on the one point of not going to the charcuterie. Just as soon as Cadine started off with her wicker tray to sell her violets, he went to the sidewalk in front of the charcuterie. "Come in," Lisa would say. She often gave him pickled cucumbers, which he adored. The sight of La belle Lisa pleased him extremely. At first she was afraid that he remembered. She asked him if his head ever hurt him. He said, "No, indeed," rocking to and fro in a childish way. "Did you fall?" she asked. "Yes, I fell," he sang in a tone of great delight. This touched Lisa. She urged Gavard to keep him, and after this interview she was not afraid to caress him, by taking him by the chin and calling him a good boy. The colossus shut his eyes with all the enjoyment of an animal, and La belle Lisa felt that she owed him this happiness as a small compensation for the blow with which she had felt him like an ox in the cellar under the market. In the meantime, the shop grew duller and more sombre. Florent dined there sometimes on Sundays, when Quenu would make frantic efforts at gaiety. One night, after one of these uncomfortable entertainments, he said to Lisa: "What can the matter be? I am not ill, and yet I have a weight on my heart. I am unhappy, but I cannot tell why. Our business is prosperous, and everything is going smoothly. You, too, ma belle," he continued, "are not right, either in health or spirits; and I think I shall send for a physician." His wife looked at him gravely. "There is no need of medicine," she said, "for there seems to be trouble everywhere just now." Then, yielding to a sudden impulse, she said, in a tender voice: "Take care of yourself, dear, for you must not be ill. That would be my crowning affliction." She kept him as much in the kitchen as possible, knowing that the noise of the chopping and the frying pleased him, and she could in that way keep him away from Mademoiselle Saget, who now passed much of her time in the shop. The old woman was doing her best to push Lisa to extremities. "There are wicked people," she said, "wicked people indeed, people who had best mind their own business. If you knew what they said, Madame Quenu! But no, I would never dare tell you." Lisa said that it was of no consequence, that she did not care in the least, and the other whispered over the counter: "They actually say that Monsieur Florent is not your cousin." And by degrees she let Lisa see that she knew all. This was one way of holding Madame Quenu at her mercy. And when Lisa confessed the truth, feeling it to be the wisest policy to hold under her hand a person who was thoroughly au courant with all the gossip of the Quartier, the old maid swore she would be as dumb as a fish, and that she would give the denial to all she heard. Then, in fact, she enjoyed the drama. She appeared each day with new reports. "You should take precautions," she said. "I heard 2 women at the tripe store talking. I could not tell, of course, that they lied. They would have thought me crazy." A few days later she came in, looking as if she were frightened out of her senses, and waited until 2 or 3 persons who were in the shop had left it, and then, in a whisper, she said: "I want to tell you that all the men who meet at the Cabaret have guns, and they intend to do what was done in '48. Is it not sad to see Monsieur Gavard, rich as he is, mixed up with all these scamps? I wanted to tell you on account of your brother in law." "But there is no truth in it, I know." "No truth in it? Go out any evening and pass la Rue Pirouette, and hear the noise they make. You remember how they did their best to lead your husband away. Is not that true? And is it not true that I have seen them with my own eyes making cartridges?" "Yes, certainly, and I thank you, only so many things are invented nowadays." "But this is not an invention, unfortunately. And everybody says that if the police could get hold of it there will be many persons compromised. Now, Monsieur Gavard—" But Lisa shook her head, as if to say that Monsieur Gavard was an old idiot, and she did not care what became of him. "I speak of Monsieur Gavard as I would speak of others — of your brother in law, for example," answered the old woman, slyly. "It seems that he is the chief of the whole movement. I am very sorry for you, for if the police should come here they might also take Monsieur Quenu. 2 brothers, you know, are like 2 fingers on the same hand." La belle Lisa turned very pale, for Mademoiselle Saget had touched the open wound of her anxieties, and from this time brought a varied collection of anecdotes every evening of innocent persons, who were thrown into prison for having sheltered rascals, and in the evening regularly called at the Cabaret, with the hope of gaining some information from Rose, and all the time keeping her eyes and ears open. She had noticed the tenderness shown by Monsieur Lebigre toward Florent, and his anxiety to keep him there, although the small purchases he made could have been no advantage to the house. "One would think," she said to herself, shrewdly, "that he expected to sell him, but to whom, I wonder?" Nor was she ignorant of the position of the 2 men toward La belle Normande, and this naturally added to her surprise. One evening when she was standing at the counter of the Cabaret, she heard Logre throw himself down in a chair in the inner room, and complain of his fatigue, saying that he had taken an enormous walk in the Faubourg. She looked down at his feet, and saw not one grain of dust. She smiled faintly, paid for her liqueur, and departed. She took up a position then at her own window to complete her observations. This window was very high, and overlooked so many of the neighboring houses that it was to her the source of infinite joy. She regarded it as her observatory. Every article in the rooms opposite she could have enumerated. She knew at what hour the people rose, and what they had for breakfast, and even the persons who came to see them. She could see the Halles, and not a woman of the Quartier could pass down la Rue Rambuteau without her knowledge. She could say, moreover, where they were going, and what they carried in their baskets. She knew how they passed each hour of the day, the number of their children, the amount of money they made weekly, and the quality of their dresses hanging in their wardrobes. That was Madame Loret, who was killing herself to educate her son, and this one was Madame Hutin, a poor little woman whose husband neglected her. And there went Mademoiselle Cecile, the butcher's daughter, whose temper was so bad that she would never be married. And the old maid could have gone on for an indefinite length of time, amusing herself in this way, but after 8 o'clock she had eyes only for the windows of the Cabaret, on which she could see the shadows of the conspirators. She divined the secession of Charvet and Clemence from the fact of not seeing their profiles. In this way she was able to follow each step of the conspiracy, so acute did she become in reading the meaning of each gesture. One night she saw Gavard's pistols, the arms of which she had spoken to Madame Quenu. Another night she was puzzled at certain movements, and decided they were manufacturing the wadding for their guns. The next morning she went to the Cabaret at an early hour, and out of the corner of her eye saw a pile of linen with red stains lying on the table in the private room. This was truly frightful. She hurried to call on Lisa. "Oh, dear Madame Quenu," she said, "I would not frighten you, but I am really terrified, and you must swear not to repeat what I say to you, for those men would certainly kill me if they knew." She then went on to speak of the red linen. "I don't know what it meant, but I could swear it was blood. Something has happened." Lisa did not reply. She played with a fork she held in her hand. Mademoiselle Saget added, softly, "If I were you, I would certainly find out. Why don't you go and look in your brother-in-law's room?" Lisa started. The fork fell from her hand. She looked the old woman full in the face. Mademoiselle Saget continued, "You have a right to do it. Your brother-in-law will certainly get you into trouble. Now, yesterday, at Madame Taboureau's, they were talking about you. She is a great friend of yours, you know, and she said that you were altogether too kind to this Monsieur Florent, and that she would have got rid of him long ago." "Madame Taboureau said that?" "Yes, certainly, and you know she is a woman who means what she says." Lisa looked with unseeing eyes from the window. A frown brought her eyebrows closer together. She was thinking. In the meantime, the little old maid had her nose among the dishes on the counter. She seemed to be talking to herself. "Bless me, here is a cut sausage. What a pity for it to dry up. And this pudding has burst. It must have been pricked by a fork. It ought to be taken away, certainly." Lisa mechanically took up the pudding and the sausage, put them in paper, saying, "They are yours if you will have them." In a moment they disappeared into the basket, which never left the woman's arm, who was now so accustomed to receiving presents that she forgot to say "thank you," and hurried away to find her dessert. When she was alone, Lisa sat down to think. For a week she had been in a state of constant anxiety. One evening Florent had told Quenu that he wanted 500 francs. He said it easily and naturally. Quenu told him to go to Lisa for the money. This was especially disagreeable to Florent, whose application was received by his sister-in-law with compressed lips. 3 days later he asked for 1,000 more. "You see I was right," said Lisa sarcastically, as she was undressing. "Your brother is not as disinterested as you thought. I must make an entry of this last 1,000 francs." She seated herself at the secretary and opened an account book. "I did well to leave a large space," she murmured. "He intends to take it all by bits, I see." Quenu did not speak. He was very much out of temper. Each time his wife opened the secretary, the creak of that falling leaf was like a despairing cry in his ears. He intended to remonstrate with his brother, and prevent him from throwing all his money away on the Mehudens, but each time he opened his lips his courage failed him. Florent in 2 days had taken 1,500 francs. Logre had said that if they had money, things would get on much faster, and the next day was overjoyed to find that these words carelessly thrown in the air came down transformed into shining gold pieces, which he quickly pocketed. After this his demands were incessant. One section wished to have a place where they could meet in safety. Another was compelled to support destitute patriots, and there were always purchases of arms to be made. Florent was ready to give all he had, and was only restrained by Lisa's disagreeable manner whenever he asked for money, for he felt that the cause was holy. Logre was in the best of spirits, and wore rose-colored cravats and patent leather boots, the sight of which seemed to have a bad effect on Lacaille's spirits. 3,000 francs in 1 week," said Lisa to Quenu. "What have you to say to that? If he goes on this way he won't have a sou at the end of 4 months. And poor old Gradelle, who worked 40 years for this money." "It is all your own fault," exclaimed Quenu. "Why did you tell him anything about the fortune?" She looked at him gravely. "It is his own," she answered. "He has a perfect right to all he asks for. I am ready to give him the money. I am only disturbed by the bad use he makes of it, and I feel that something must be done." "Do what you please," muttered Quenu, tortured by avarice. "I won't interfere with you." He loved his brother still, but the thought of 50,000 francs melting away in 4 months disturbed him greatly. Lisa, assisted by Mademoiselle Saget, had a very clear idea of its destination, and even went so far as to tell the little old maid how much Florent had drawn, wishing the truth to be circulated in the Quartier. This occurred the day before the story of the blood-stained linen was brought to her, and which decided her. She looked around the shop, which seemed to her very dreary. Even Monton the cat had a discontented air. She hastily summoned Augustine to take her place, and went up to Florent's room. She started when she opened the door. The purity of the white bed was stained by a pile of red sashes, which streamed down upon the coverlid. On the mantelpiece were cockades and epaulettes, scarlet and gold. Flags of all colors were hung against the wall. Thanks to her investigations of her brother-in-law's private papers, she knew that these were the colors of the different sections. The photographs of Auguste and Augustine looked pale with fright amid all these revolutionary insignia. Lisa looked at everything, but touched nothing, holding herself aloof as if they were red hot and would burn her. It was thus, then, that the money, so hardly and so honestly earned, was spent. She stood looking out. The glowing flowers on the balcony were to her only other cockades, and the birds' song sounded in her ears like the echo of musketry. Then, as the idea came to her, that the insurrection would burst out to-morrow, she heard the roll of drums and the clear notes of the bugle. She hurried downstairs without a glance at the papers on the table, but she went no further than her own room, which she entered. At this solemn crisis, Lisa deliberately dressed her hair with all her usual care. Her hands did not tremble, and her eyes were fixed. As she buttoned the waist of her black silk dress, using all the strength in her wrists to bring it together, she remembered what the Abbe Roustan had said. She asked herself the question, and decided that she was only doing her duty. And as she pinned her shawl, she felt that she was a thoroughly honest woman. She put a thick veil over her hat, and drew on dark gloves. Before going out, she locked her secretary, as if to impart to it a comfortable sense of security that it would not soon be again disturbed. Quenu was standing at the shop door in his white apron. He was quite surprised to see her go out in this grand toilette at 10 o'clock in the morning. "Where on earth are you going?" he asked. She invented some story about a shopping day with Madame Taboureau. She added that as she should pass the Gaiety, she would take seats for the evening. Quenu ran after her, and told her to be sure and take them in the center of the house. She smilingly assented, and went on to the cab stand, where she took a fiacre, telling the coachman to drive to the Gaiety. She feared being followed. When she had her tickets, she went to the Palais de Justice, where she dismissed the carriage, and went slowly through the halls and corridors. As she was lost amid the hurry and confusion, she gave 10 sous to a man, who guided her to the private room of the chief of police. She was received with politeness by a stout, bald personage dressed in black. She lifted her veil, and told her story frankly, without any concealments. The gentleman listened without interrupting her, and when she had finished he said simply : You are this man's sister in law, are you ?" Yes," answered Lisa. " We are honest people, and I do not wish my husband to be compromised." He shrugged his shoulders and waved his hand as if this remark were very foolish. Then, with an air of impatience, he said : For more than a year I have known all you tell me. The man has been denounced again and again. You understand that if I have not acted, it is because I prefer waiting. We have our reasons. I will show you." He laid before her a huge pile of papers. She turned them over. They were, in fact, the detached pieces of the history she had just told. The authorities of Havre, Rouen, and Vernon announced Florent's arrival. Then his installation at the Quenu Gradelles' was noted, his entrance at the Halles, his life, his evenings spent at the Cabaret. Not an incident was omitted. Lisa noticed that the reports were double, as if they came from two different sources. Then came a heap of anonymous letters, of all forms and styles. This was the climax. She recognized the fine scrawl of Mademoiselle Saget, denouncing the set of men who frequented the club. She saw, too, a large sheet of coarse paper with Madame Lecoeur's hieroglyphics, and one shining page, a joint work of La Sarriette and Monsieur Jules. These last two letters cautioned the government against Gavard. She recognized also Mother Mehuden's coarse language, who, in 4 pages which were almost illegible, recounted all the tales which were in circulation in regard to Florent. But she was utterly overwhelmed when she beheld one of the printed bills of the house, bearing the words, Charcuterie, Quenu Gradelles, on the back of which Auguste denounced the man, whom he regarded as the obstacle to his marriage. She was asked if she recognized any of these handwritings. She stammered forth the word No, and rose to leave. She drew down her veil to conceal her agitation and vague bewilderment. Her hands trembled as she drew up her shawl. The bald man smiled faintly. You see, Madame, that you are a little late. But I assure you that we shall remember what you have done. Tell your husband not to lift a finger. Certain circumstances may occur." He did not conclude his sentence, but bowed slightly, and half rose from his chair. She felt herself dismissed, and went away. In the ante room she saw Logre and Monsieur Lebigre, who hastily turned away, but she was more disturbed than they. She hurried through the corridors, feeling that there was no escape from the police, who knew and saw everything. She went to the Quai de l'Horloge, where she walked for some little time, soothed and refreshed by the cool air from the Seine. She felt most keenly the uselessness of the step she had taken. Her husband was in no danger after all. This was of course a relief, and yet gave her a certain sense of remorse. She was vexed with these women who had placed her in such a ridiculous position. She stood still and looked at the Seine. Some coal barges were coming toward her, from the end of which men were fishing. It was not she, then, who had delivered Florent into the hands of the Philistines. The relief she felt at this thought astonished her. Would she have committed an infamous act in doing so? She hesitated, and wondered if she had been deceived by her conscience. The anonymous letters seemed to her more atrocious than anything she had ever dreamed of. She had gone openly to fulfill what she believed to be her duty. She asked herself if the Gradelle money counted for anything in her decision. No, she was not avaricious. Money had nothing to do with it, and she gradually recovered her ease of mind. Did you get the seats?" asked Quenu, when she went into the house. He wished to see the tickets, and explained to her precisely where they were, all of which she had ascertained before purchasing them. This theatre project was devised by her, merely to get her husband out of the house while the police made a descent on Florent, which she supposed they would do as soon as her story was heard. She had intended asking him to go to walk in the Bois. They would dine at a restaurant, and go from thence to the theatre. On their return they would find Florent gone. Now the programme was changed, and it was not necessary to go out, until it was time for the theatre. I told you it did you good to go out," said Quenu. You look as different as possible. You should take a walk every day." No," she answered coldly. The streets of Paris are not good for the health." That evening at the Gaieté they played the Grâce de Dieu. Quenu, in a black coat and pearl colored gloves, studied the programme with great earnestness. Lisa was superb, and folded her arms on the red velvet railing. Her white gloves were too tight, and her arms bulged above them. They were both greatly moved by Marie's misfortunes. The commander was a vile man, and Pierrot made them laugh as soon as he appeared. The charcutière wept bitterly in the pathetic scenes. The child's departure, the prayer and return of the poor mad girl, brought tears to her eyes, which she gently wiped away with her handkerchief. This soirée was a veritable triumph to her, when, on raising her eyes, she beheld La Normande and her mother in the second gallery. She bridled, sent Quenu for a box of caramels, played with her fan, one of mother of pearl with considerable gilding. This was too much for the fish woman. She dropped her head, and seemed to be listening to her mother's whispers. When they met in the vestibule, the two women smiled coldly at each other. Florent had dined early that day with Monsieur Lebigre. He was waiting for Logre, who was to present to him an old sergeant, a man whom he was sure to find very useful, and who would assist them in devising the attack against the Palais Bourbon and the Hotel de Ville. As night came on, a fine rain began to fall, and veiled the Halles, while the low, heavy black clouds seemed to rest almost upon the roofs of the houses. Florent was saddened by the aspect of things, and by the rush of yellow water in the gutters. Logre did not bring the sergeant. Gavard had gone to dine with friends at Batignolles. Florent was reduced to passing the evening tete-a-tete with Robine. He was early wearied out, and went off to bed; but when he reached his room felt nervous and restless. The evening before, he had been at the funeral of Monsieur Valoque, who had died after long and acute sufferings. He would not forget that narrow coffin, nor poor Madame Valoque's tears. She had told him that none of the expenses of the funeral were paid, and that she had not a sou in the house. Florent paid everything, and the poor woman looked so utterly heartbroken that, as he left the house, he put into her hand 20 francs. This death naturally established him in his position as inspector of the markets. He was impatient for the insurrection to burst forth, that he might throw aside the braided cap forever. With all these contradictory thoughts and plans surging within him, he opened his window and stepped out on the balcony. The wind had gone down, the rain had ceased, but there were no stars in the sky. Leaning over the railing, Florent said to himself that sooner or later he should be punished for having accepted a position under the government. It was a blemish on his life, and he felt that he had perjured himself by serving the Empire, after the oaths he had sworn to himself so many times while in exile. The desire of pleasing Lisa, the charitable use of his emoluments, were not strong enough arguments to excuse his weakness. His sufferings, whatever they might be, he deserved. He lived over again the last wretched year. The persecutions of the market women, the nausea he had constantly felt from the atrocious smells, and the hostility which was rapidly growing about him. All these things he accepted as a chastisement. He felt a dull conviction that some catastrophe was close at hand, and bowed his head to accept it in expiation of his fault. The rain of the afternoon had filled the Halles with dampness which brought out all the intolerable smells. It seemed to him that from these markets enclosed under one roof rose a thick vapor. The butchers' and tripe merchants' stalls sent forth an odor of blood. The vegetable and fruit markets exhaled the acrid smell of sour cabbages, rotten apples and decayed vegetables. The butter was rancid, and the fish tainted. At his feet was the poultry market, smelling like a stable. He heard a gay laugh, and the sound of a door closing noisily. It was Quenu and Lisa coming home from the theatre. And Florent started, and with a shiver, went in and closed the blinds. Chapter 6 of The Markets of Paris by Emile Zola. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ring-doves and pigeons. One morning at daybreak, Florent forgot his duties at the market, and explored each street in the vicinity of the Palais Bourbon. He went as far as the Esplanade des Invalides, and measured certain distances by taking long strides. Then he went to the Quai d'Orsay, and leaning over the parapet decided that the attack should be simultaneous. The band from Gaucaillou would arrive by the Champ de Mars. The sections from the north of Paris should sweep down by the Madeleine. Those of the west and south must follow the quai. He looked toward the opposite shore with some anxiety. The Champs Elysées and the wide avenues were difficult to deal with. He saw, too, that cannon placed there would sweep the whole quai. Then he changed some details of his plan, and made several alterations in the paper he held in his hand. The real attack should be made by la Rue du Bourgogne and la Rue de l'Universable. The sun now touched his shoulders, and shone on the wide sidewalks and gilded the monuments opposite him. He saw the battle. He saw men clinging to these columns, and then, far above, he beheld lean hands flinging out the flag to the breeze. He went slowly homeward. Suddenly he heard a soft cooing sound, and realized that he was in the garden of the Tuileries, and saw the turtle doves sunning themselves on the lawn. He leaned against a box that held a huge orange tree and looked around. The shadow of the large chestnut trees was very heavy. The air was sweet with perfume, and made him think of Madame Fran9ois. A little girl ran past with her hoop, and frightened the turtle doves. They flew away and alighted on the arm of a marble athlete in the centre of the green sward, where they pecked and plumed themselves. As he entered the Halles, he heard the voice of Claude Lantier calling to him. "Come with me," said the painter. "I am looking for that little brute Marjolin." Florent followed him, merely to get away from himself, and to put off, as long as possible, his return to his distasteful duties at the market. Claude said that Marjolin was perfectly happy. He was a mere beast, walking on 2 legs instead of 4. That was about all the difference. "He may be stuffing the pigeons," said Claude. "We could go and see." They went into the cellar, in the centre of which 2 fountains were playing. The houses here were devoted exclusively to pigeons. Behind the gratings there arose a plaintive sound, a perpetual rippling note. Claude laughed, and said to his companion, "I should think all the lovers in Paris were in this place." But as every one of these rooms, or houses, seemed to be locked, he came to the conclusion that Marjolin could not be in the cellar. Suddenly they heard the sound of a gentle, continual kissing, and they discovered one door that was ajar. They pushed it open, and beheld Cadine with Marjolin kneeling in front of her so that his face was on a level with her lips. She was kissing him tenderly on his hair, his brow, his eyes, slowly and methodically. He complacently remained just as she placed him, and allowed her to do as she pleased. He had no longer a will of his own. "Aren't you ashamed?" said Claude. "In this dirty place, too?" "But," answered Cadine, with impudent effrontery, "he is afraid anywhere that is light. Is it not so, dear? You are afraid sometimes, are you not?" He passed his hands over his face, as if seeking the kisses she had left there. He answered with a vague smile, "Yes, that he was afraid." "I came to help him, too," the girl added. "I am stuffing the pigeons." Florent looked at the poor creatures. All around the place on shelves were uncovered boxes, in which pigeons were placed close against each other. Every few moments a light shiver ran through the moving mass. Cadine had a saucepan at her side full of water and grain. She filled her mouth, took up the pigeons one by one, opened their beaks, and blew this food down their throats; and they, struggling and choking, fell back into their boxes, dizzy with the food thus swallowed by force. "Poor things!" said Claude. "They are not poor things at all. They are very comfortable now. In 2 hours they will be made to swallow salted water. This makes them white and tender, and 2 hours after that they are bled. If you would like to see that done, you can look at Marjolin, for he has 50 to do now." Claude and Florent followed Marjolin. He sat down on the ground by the fountain, put the box of pigeons by his side, and placed on his knees a tin case with wires across set in a wooden frame. He seized the pigeons by the wings, and with a quick blow on the head with the handle of the knife, stunned them, and then inserted the point in the throat. The pigeons shivered, and he arranged them in rows, the heads between these iron wires, over the tin box, into which the blood dropped slowly. He did this with the regular movement of a machine at first, but by degrees seemed to become excited. His eyes glittered, and he moved quicker and quicker. He finally burst out laughing. "Tic tac, tic tac, tic tac," he sang, accompanying the noise made by the knife on the heads of the poor creatures with a movement of his tongue. "He likes that," said Cadine. "Pigeons are funny when they put their heads down so far between their shoulders that we can't find their necks." She laughed again as she watched Marjolin's feverish haste. "I have tried, but I can never do it as fast as he. One day he bled 110 minutes.
Claude, happening to glance at Florent, saw him so pale that he hastily led him to the stairs, where he made him sit down.
Well, well," he said, who would have thought that you could faint like a woman?"
It was the smell," answered Florent, a little ashamed. These pigeons, who were made to swallow grain and salt water, and then bled to death, had reminded him of the turtle doves of the Tuileries, walking in their changeable satiny plumage on the turf golden with sunlight. He saw them gurgling and cooing on the arm of the antique statue in the silent garden, while, in the dark shadow of the chestnut trees, the little girl played with her hoop. This huge, senseless brute, killing these little creatures, had chilled him to the marrow of his bones.
You will make no kind of a soldier, my boy," said Claude. The people who sent you to Cayenne were simple creatures to be afraid of you. Look out, my dear fellow, never to get into any trouble, for if you should fire a pistol and happen to kill any one, you would faint away." Florent rose, but did not answer. He had become very serious, and heavy lines contracted his forehead. He went away, leaving Claude to return to the pigeons and Marjolin. As he walked through the fish market, he thought again of his plan of attack, and of the armed bands which would invade the Palais Bourbon. In the Champs Elys^es the cannon would reverberate, the windows would be broken, there would be blood and brains spattered on the columns. A rapid vision passed before his eyes. He passed his hand over them, not daring to look. As he crossed la Rue du Pont Neuf, he thought he saw Auguste's pale face in the fruit market. He seemed to be waiting or watching for some one, and his eyes were wide open with a wild stare. He suddenly turned and fled in the direction of the Charcuterie. What on earth is the matter? Thought Florent. He behaves as if he were afraid of me. Grave events had taken place that morning at the Quenu Gradelles'. At daybreak, Auguste had rushed to the room of his employers to tell them that the police had come to arrest Florent, and then added, in a confused way, that he thought Florent had got away. La belle Lisa, in her dressing gown, ran upstairs and took the photograph of La belle Normande from the drawer of her brother-in-law and went down again. On the landing she met the police agent, who begged to speak to her a moment. He bade her open her shop as usual, and to say nothing to any one. He put his men into possession of Florent's room. Thus was the trap laid and baited. Lisa's only anxiety in this whole affair was as to how Quenu would receive this blow. She feared that he would ruin all by his tears if he should discover that the police was there. As yet he had not been disturbed, and she prepared a little tale with which to delude him when he awoke. In another half hour she was at her door, with her hair as carefully dressed as usual, accurately dressed, and smiles on her rosy face. Auguste was arranging the shop. Quenu came out, yawned a little, and shook himself in the fresh morning air. Nothing indicated the drama that was in preparation. But the commissary himself was the one to awaken suspicion in the Quartier by making a domiciliary visit to the Mehudens. He was furnished with the most accurate information. In the anonymous letters received at the Prefecture it was said that La belle Normande was the mistress of Florent. She therefore had probably sheltered and concealed him now. The commissary, accompanied by 2 men, shook the door and demanded admittance in the name of the law. The Mehudens were hardly up. The old woman opened the door in a rage, which was suddenly calmed when she understood what the demand meant. She took a seat, and calmly fastened her clothing, while she said: "You can look where you choose, gentlemen. We are honest people, and have nothing to fear." As La Normande did not see fit to open her door, the commissary ordered it to be forced. She was dressing, and her shoulders were bare. This brutal entrance exasperated her. The skirt that she was just throwing over her head dropped from her hands, and she rushed forward red with anger rather than shame. The commissary, faced by this half naked woman, advanced in front of his men, saying in a cold, stern voice: "In the name of the law! In the name of the law!" She fell into a chair, weeping and sobbing. Her hair streamed over her shoulders. Her chemise did not reach her knees. The men looked away, while the commissary caught up a shawl and threw it over her, but she did not notice it. She wept hysterically as she saw these men open her wardrobe and look under her bed. "What have I done?" she gasped. "What are you looking for here?" The commissary uttered Florent's name just as Mother Mehuden entered the room. "Ah, wretch!" cried her daughter, rushing toward her. One of the men caught her and wrapped her in the shawl. She struggled and said: "For what do you take me, then? This Florent never crossed this threshold. Put me in prison if you choose. What do I care for this Florent? I can marry a better man than he any day." This flood of words calmed her. Her fury now turned against Florent, who was the cause of this insult. She addressed the commissary, and tried to justify herself. "I did not know, sir. He was very quiet and very gentle, and he deceived us all. I did not want to listen to the people who abused him. He came to give my little boy lessons, for which I tried to pay an occasional present of a fine fish, and this is all."
"But where are the papers he gave you to take care of?"
"Papers? He never gave me any papers. If he had, I would give them to you. I swear I would, rather than see you rummage among all my things in this way. I tell you it is not worth while for you to look." The men, having completed their search in her room, now opened a door leading to the closet where Much slept. In a moment the child was heard crying aloud. Awakened from a deep sleep, he apparently thought he was about to be murdered. La Normande called to him, and he ran to her and clung about her neck. She consoled him, and placed him in her own bed. The men were about to leave, when the child said, in a whisper: "Don't let them take my copy books." "To be sure! Your copy books!" cried La Normande. "Wait a moment, gentlemen. I have something for you. You will see plenty of his writing now, and if you wish to hang him, do so. I won't cut the rope." She handed them the copy books, which utterly infuriated the child, who began to kick and scratch his mother, who was trying to hold him. Finding that he could not get away, he began to bellow. Mademoiselle Saget stuck in her head. She had come, finding the doors all open, saying that she really pitied these poor ladies who had no one to defend them. In the meantime, the commissary was reading the copies set by Florent with a heavy frown. He gave a little tap to the paper. "This is very serious," he said. "Very serious indeed." He handed the bundle of copy books to one of his men, and departed. Claire, who had not appeared, now opened her door, and looked at the men as they went down stairs. She then entered her sister's room, where she had not been for a year. Mademoiselle Saget was fluttering about La belle Normande, caressing her and wrapping the shawl more closely about her. "You are a mean coward," said Claire, planting herself before her sister, who started up, the shawl again falling to the floor. "You were listening, were you? Say that again, if you dare. You are a mean coward," repeated the girl in a tone that was even more insulting. Then La Normande rushed forward and slapped Claire's pale face, who, frail as she was, grasped her sister by the throat. They struggled for a moment, tearing out each other's hair. The younger, with superhuman force, pushed the other against the wardrobe, the glass of which shivered. Much sobbed, and Mother Mehuden shrieked to Mademoiselle Saget to separate them. But Claire shook herself free. "Mean coward that you are," she repeated, "I am now going to warn the man you have sold." Her mother threw herself across the door, and La Normande, with the assistance of the little old maid, hustled Claire into her room, whose door they locked. There was a dead silence, and then a dull, grating sound. "She is trying to take off the hinges with her scissors," said La Normande contemptuously, as she went about trying to find her clothes, which had been somewhat scattered in the mêlée. "She would have killed me without any hesitation," said La Normande, "if she could. And now she must be kept in her room, or she will make the most fearful row in the Quartier." Mademoiselle Saget was naturally in great haste to depart. She reached the corner of la Rue Pirouette just as the commissary and his men went into the Charcuterie. She followed in such a state of excitement that Lisa made a sign to her to be quiet, with a glance at Quenu. When they went into the kitchen, the old maid told what had taken place at the Mehudens. Lisa listened with an air of triumph. But when a customer asked for 2 pigs' feet, she wrapped them up thoughtfully, as she said : "Look here. To show you that I have no enmity against La Normande, you may tell her that I have saved this from the police, and am ready to give it back to her, if she comes and asks me for it." She took the photograph from her pocket. Mademoiselle Saget looked at it, and read aloud: "Louise to her good friend Florent." Then, in a significant tone, she said: "You make a mistake. You should keep this." "No," answered Lisa. "I wish this affair to be ended, once for all. To day is the day for a reconciliation, and after this I hope the Quartier will settle down. Do you want me to tell La belle Normande that you would like to see her?" "Yes, if you would be so kind." Mademoiselle Saget returned to la Rue Pirouette, and frightened the fish woman out of her senses by telling her that her picture was in Lisa's pocket. But she could not at once decide to make the concession demanded by her rival. She too had her conditions to make. She would go if the charcutière would come to the door to receive her. The old maid was obliged to make 2 more trips between the rivals in order to make the arrangement satisfactory to both parties. Mademoiselle Saget was quite willing to take this trouble, as she was to be credited with the reconciliation which would, of course, cause such excitement in the Quartier. As she passed Claire's door, she still heard the noise of the scissors. As soon as these points were settled, she went off in a hurry to get Madame Lecoeur and La Sarriette. They established themselves nearly opposite of the charcuterie, where they could see the entire interview. The 3 women became very impatient as they waited there. The story had got abroad in the Halles, and every one was on the qui vive; while eyes were turned toward the shop of the Quenu Gradelle. And when La Normande appeared, they held their breath. "Look at her earrings," said La Sarriette. "Just see how she walks," exclaimed Madame Lecoeur. "It is for all the world like a peacock." La belle Normande, in fact, held herself like a queen who condescends to sign a treaty of peace. She had made a most careful toilette, and had turned up a corner of her crisp white apron to show her black cashmere skirt. At her throat was a gorgeous tie of lace. As she felt that the whole Halles were looking at her, she carried her head still higher. She stopped at the door of the charcuterie. "Now it is the turn of La belle Lisa," said Mademoiselle Saget. Lisa left her counter with smiling grace. She crossed her shop with a leisurely step, and extended her hand to La belle Normande. She was carefully dressed, her collar, apron and cuffs of immaculate purity. The 2 women disappeared within the shop, and the spectators could exchange remarks, as it was no use to try and hear. "She is buying something," said Mademoiselle Saget. "La belle Normande is certainly buying something, and look, Lisa is giving her the photograph." Then followed more salutations, and La belle Lisa accompanied her fair rival to the very sidewalk. There they stood and talked for a good 5 minutes for the edification of the Quartier, who felt that the quarrel was happily concluded. But Mademoiselle Saget would not allow her 2 companions to leave her. The crowning act of the drama was near at hand. "And now La belle Normande has no lover," said Madame Lecoeur. "She has Monsieur Lebigre," remarked La Sarriette, laughing. "Oh, Monsieur Lebigre! He won't have her now." Mademoiselle Saget shrugged her shoulders, murmuring: "You know nothing about it. He won't trouble himself much about this affair. La Normande is rich, and in 2 months they will be man and wife. You will see. Mother Mehuden has done her best to bring this marriage about for a long time." "But," said Madame Lecoeur, "after all, there has nothing wrong been found out. Florent was not in her room." "Not then," answered the old maid, significantly, "but that does not prove that he has not been there. I believe myself that he has just gone. The worst of the whole thing was," she continued, "the horrible things these men said before little Much. Now, I don't mean that the child amounts to much, but that is no reason why the police should be allowed to frighten him out of his senses. But look, there is poor Monsieur Quenu, and he is laughing." Quenu, in fact, was standing on the sidewalk in his white apron, talking with Madame Taboureau's little servant. He was in the best of spirits that morning, and Lisa had the greatest difficulty in the world in keeping him in the kitchen. She walked up and down the shop impatiently, fearing that Florent would come in, and that her husband would be there. "She is in a fever," said Mademoiselle Saget. "Her poor husband knows nothing about it at all. Just see him laugh now. You know that Madame Taboureau said she should quarrel with the Quenus if they were so weak minded as to keep Florent with them any longer." "And in the meantime they have all the money," said Madame Lecoeur. "By no means, my dear. He has had his share." "Is that really so? Do you know it?" "I know it," answered the old maid, but she did not say how. "He has even had more than he is entitled to.
Ah, a profligate man makes the money fly. And then, there is another woman." "I did not know it," answered La Sarriette, "but I am not surprised." "Yes, the wife of the former inspector, Madame Valoque." The others exclaimed at this. Madame Valoque was so ugly. "But I know it," continued Mademoiselle Saget. "There are proofs, piles of letters from that woman, letters asking him for money; and I believe that they too killed the husband." La Sarriette and Madame Lecoeur were convinced, of course, but they were tired of waiting. They said to each other that their stalls were left alone, and were probably robbed by this time, but Mademoiselle Saget begged them to stay a moment longer, all the time keeping her own eyes riveted on the house, whose front was bathed in the morning sun. "Who would think that it was full of police?" murmured Madame Lecoeur. "They are in the attic. Look! I can see one now, behind those plants on the terrace." The others extended their necks, but could see nothing. "No, I was mistaken. It was a shadow," explained La Sarriette. "They must be sitting still in the room." At this moment they saw Gavard come out of the fish market with a preoccupied air. He was coming toward them. "Have you seen Florent?" he asked, as he reached them. They did not reply. "I want to see him at once," continued Gavard. "He is not in the fish market. Has he gone in?" The three women were all unnaturally pale, and their lips trembled. Madame Lecoeur was the first to speak. "We have been here only a few moments," she said. "He may have gone in." "Then I will undertake those 5 flights of stairs," answered Gavard, laughing. La Sarriette opened her lips as if to warn him, but her aunt held her arm tightly. "Let him go," she whispered, "and he may, perhaps, learn not to walk over us another time." La Sarriette stood still with a flushed face, but the others were yellow white. They looked at the house as if they could see Gavard through the stones as he ascended the stairs. La Sarriette uttered a nervous little laugh when she thought her uncle had had time to reach Florent's room. They fancied that they saw the curtains move. 15 minutes elapsed, and all was quiet. Then a man came out of the alley and went for a fiacre. In another 5 minutes Gavard came down with 2 men. Gavard was very pale. He had been searched and his pistol and box of cartridges taken from him. He thought himself lost, and was surprised that the idea of this denouement had never entered his head. The Tuileries would never forgive him. His limbs felt strangely weak, but he held himself straight, determined that the Halles should see that he died bravely. Madame Lecoeur and La Sarriette rushed to his side and begged for an explanation. He took his niece in his arms, and, as he kissed her, murmured in her ear, as he gave her a key, "Burn all my papers." He entered the fiacre with the air of a man ascending the scaffold. When the carriage disappeared around the corner, Madame Lecoeur saw her niece trying to hide the key. "You need not take so much trouble," she said, between her teeth. "I saw him put it in your hand. As true as there is a God in heaven, I will go before the Prefect and declare the truth unless you share with me." "But, my dear aunt," answered La Sarriette, with an embarrassed smile, "let us go at once, before those thieves get there." Mademoiselle Saget, who had heard all this, followed their fleet steps as quickly as she could. As they neared Gavard's home, she offered to go on and explain to Madame L4once the reason of their coming. "We will see to it ourselves," said Madame Lecoeur, stiffly. The housekeeper was by no means willing to show these ladies up stairs. She looked austerely at La Sarriette's untidy fichu. But when Mademoiselle Saget said a few words in a low voice and showed her the key, she yielded. "Take everything," she said, throwing herself into a chair, as if abandoning all hope. La Sarriette tried the key in all the wardrobes, while Madame Lecoeur watched her closely, and stood so near to her that finally she exclaimed : "Please stand a little farther off, aunt. I can't use my arms." At last a wardrobe opposite the window was opened. The 4 women uttered a simultaneous exclamation. On the center shelf were 10,000 francs in methodical little piles. Gavard, whose property was prudently deposited in the hands of a notary, kept this sum in reserve ready for an emergency. He looked on them as aid to the insurrection, and dreamed at night that a battle was going on within his wardrobe. He heard the beat of drums, the rattling of musketry, and triumphant shouts.
It was his money which did all this. La Sarriette uttered a little shriek of joy, and extended her hands. Paws off, my dear!" exclaimed Madame Lecoeur in a hoarse voice. The woman was slowly dying of an affection of the liver, but her skin turned yellower than ever, and seemed to reflect the gold which lay before her. Peering over her shoulder was Mademoiselle Saget, standing on the points of her toes, in an ecstasy of delight. My uncle told me to take everything," said La Sarriette. And am I, who have watched over him in sickness and in health, to have nothing?" asked the housekeeper. Madame Lecoeur pushed them all away, and planting herself before the wardrobe, she said : I am his nearest relative, and you are robbers — all of you," she added with some violence. There was a long and profound silence. The four women looked at each other. La Sarriette, palpitating with life, youth and hope, offered a strange contrast to the other women. But," continued Madame Lecoeur, we do not wish to quarrel about it. You are his niece, his only niece, and we will divide. We will each of us take a pile in turn." She bade the other two step back, and she began. She took one pile which disappeared among her skirts. Then La Sarriette did the same. Then the two hands laid side by side on the shelf. One with horrible distorted fingers, the other white, delicate and supple as silk. There was one pile left, which the aunt claimed. But La Sarriette disputed this, as it was her aunt who commenced the division, and she divided it between Madame L4once, who had seen them pocket the gold with gasps of horror, and Mademoiselle Saget. Bless my soul," said the housekeeper, 50 francs for taking care of that old man all this time. He said he had no family, the old cheat." Madame Lecoeur, before closing the wardrobe, wished to search it thoroughly. It contained all the political books which were not allowed to cross the frontiers — pamphlets from Brussels, scandalous tales of the Bonapartes, and caricatures of the Emperor. One of Gavard's greatest delights had been to shut himself up and show a friend these compromising papers. He begged us to burn these papers," said La Sarriette. Nonsense. There is no fire, and we had best be off." Hardly had they reached the foot of the stairs than the police appeared. Madame L4once went back to show them to Gavard's rooms. The others pursued their way, the aunt and niece somewhat incommoded by the weight of their full pockets, but enjoying them all the same. Mademoiselle Saget held her 50 francs tight in her hand, all the time revolving a plan for obtaining something more from out of those full pockets. There is Florent!" she exclaimed as they neared the fish market. Florent it was indeed. He was going to his office to change his coat, having completed his daily task. It seemed to him that people looked at him strangely. He wondered if there were any trouble in store for him. But as he passed the Mehudens' stall, he was surprised to hear the old woman say, in a gentle voice : Monsieur Florent, there was a gentleman looking for you. I think he has gone to your room, to wait for you there." The old fish woman sitting in her stall enjoyed as she uttered these words a refinement of vengeance which shook her enormous frame with joy. Florent looked questioningly at La belle Normande, who now, on the best of terms with her mother, was bustling about, and pretended not to hear. You are sure?" he asked. Oh, certainly. One couldn't be sure," she answered in a sharp voice. Florent thought that this gentleman had come in relation to the great affair. He was about leaving the market, when, as he turned, he caught sight of La belle Normande, who was watching him with a very grave face. He passed the 3 women. You notice," murmured Mademoiselle Saget, that there is no one in the shop. La belle Lisa is not the woman to compromise herself." It was true. The charcuterie was empty. The house lay basking in the sunlight with a comfortable sort of air. The flowers were blooming gaily, high up on the balcony, and as Florent crossed the sidewalk, he nodded to Logre and to Monsieur Lebigre, who were standing at the door of the wine shop. These gentlemen smiled in a friendly sort of way. He was about to enter the narrow alley when he perceived Auguste's pale face flash through the darkness. He turned back and looked into the shop, but saw only Monton, who glared at him out of his large yellow eyes. His whiskers had a fiercer aspect than usual. When he finally entered the alley, he saw La belle Lisa watching him from behind a curtain of a glass door. Profound silence reigned in the fish market. Every eye was fixed on that house. Suddenly a laugh ran around the Halles. Mother Mehudin's story of the gentleman waiting to see Florent struck them as a capital joke. At last, the Skeleton — Mother Mehudin's favorite name for the Inspector — was caught, and they wished him bon voyage, hoping devoutly that his successor was better looking. La belle Normande looked on at this joy, and had great difficulty in restraining her tears. Meanwhile, Florent had gone up to his room, where he allowed himself to be taken without the smallest resistance, which he saw would be utterly useless. He took a chair and looked at the men, as they turned over the papers and opened all the packages of scarves and badges. This denouement was, after all, no surprise to him, and was, in fact, rather a relief, although he would not have confessed even to himself that such was the case. His keenest sufferings were caused by the remembrance of the hatred which had pushed him into this room. He recalled Auguste's pale face, and the whispers of the fish women. He remembered Mother Mehudin's words, the silence of La Normande, and the vacant shop, and said to himself that all these people were accomplices, and that the Quartier had delivered him up. Among this crowd of faces which he saw as he sat with his hands pressed over his eyes, suddenly appeared Quenu's pale face. He was cut to the heart. " Come on," said the police agent roughly. He rose and went down with the men. On the next floor he asked to be allowed to go back for something he had forgotten, but the man pushed him on. He offered them money even, and finally two agreed to go back with him, swearing they would break his head if he played them any trick. They took their revolvers from their pockets. He returned to his room, went to the cage, and took out the bird, kissed it on its glossy head, and let it fly. He watched as it lighted on the roof of the fish market, and then was off again, disappearing over the Halles. He looked out toward the sky, and thought of the doves in the garden of the Tuileries, and then of the pigeons quivering in Marjolin's hands. He bowed his head and followed the men, who shrugged their shoulders and put their revolvers in their pockets. At the foot of the stairs, Florent stopped before the door which opened on the kitchen of the Charcuterie. The commissary who was waiting there was touched by his submissiveness, and said : "Do you wish to bid your brother good bye?" He hesitated a moment. He looked at the door, from behind which came a deafening noise of choppers and mallets. Lisa, to occupy her husband, had suggested making the pudding, which was usually done in the evening. Onions were frying on the fire. Florent heard Quenu say : "Zounds, this pudding will be good." Florent thanked the commissary, but was afraid to go into that hot kitchen, full of the smell of cooking. He passed the door, strong in the belief that his brother knew nothing, and hastening his steps to avoid giving him an additional sorrow. As he entered the fiacre, he felt ashamed to know that all the fish women were triumphing over him. "How guilty he looks," whispered Madame Lecoeur. "Yes," added Mademoiselle Saget, "he has the air of a convict." "I once saw a man guillotined," murmured La Sarriette, "who had just that expression." They stretched out their necks to look into the fiacre. Just as it drove off, the old maid pulled the skirts of her companions to call their attention to Claire, who was running toward them with flying hair and bleeding hands. She had torn open her door. When she understood that she was too late, she shook her fist at the fiacre with impotent rage, then rushed away as swiftly as she had come, the plaster rising in fine clouds from her garments as she moved. "He must have promised to marry her," cried La Sarriette, laughing. The Quartier now calmed down, though groups still passed the windows of the Charcuterie, looking in curiously. Lisa did not appear at the counter. She left Augustine to attend to all the duties there. She intended to tell all to Quenu that afternoon, lest some chatterbox should disclose the truth too abruptly. She wanted to be alone with him in the kitchen, knowing that he would burst into tears and make a terrible scene. She therefore proceeded with much care. But as soon as he understood it, he dropped upon the chopping block and sobbed like a child. "Poor, dear boy," said Lisa, smoothing his arm. "You must not go on like this. You will hurt yourself." His sobs subsided, and, when he could speak, he said : "You can never know how good he was to me when we were living in la Rue Royer Collard. He did everything there. He swept and cooked. He loved me as if I were his own child. He worked like a dog, and came home tired to death, and I had all I wanted to eat and was warm and lazy. And now they will shoot him." Lisa exclaimed at this, and told him that Florent would not be shot — that was ridiculous. He shook his head and continued : "No, I never loved him half enough. I was selfish and mean, and I wanted to keep his money." "But I offered it to him 20 times," she interrupted. "We have nothing to reproach ourselves with." "I know that you have always been goodness itself to him, but I have been selfish, and I believe if I had shared everything with him, that he would not have turned out badly a second time. It is all my own fault." She was very gentle with him. She even expressed sympathy for Florent. He was guilty, certainly, and if he had had more money he might not have committed so many follies; and by degrees, she hazarded the opinion that perhaps it was better as it was. Quenu wiped his eyes and ceased sobbing, that he might hear what she said, and at last put his hand mechanically on his chopping knife. "You have not been well," said Lisa, "nor have I, and I was really very anxious about you. And the shop, too, has been a very different place." "Yes, indeed," sobbed Quenu. "And you must remember," added Lisa, "that you have a wife and a child to think of. You have duties to fulfill toward us." He smiled faintly. Lisa had done wonders. She called Pauline, who was playing in the shop, placed her on her father's knees, and said : "Pauline, ask your father to be good, and not make us miserable." The child did as she was told. The two looked at each other, and then at their child, and they smiled, with a sense of relief that they were once more by themselves, while the charcutiere repeated 2 or 3 times : "There are only 3 of us, dear. Only 3 of us." 2 months later, Florent was condemned again to exile. The affair made a great noise. The journals got hold of all the details, gave portraits of the accused, and drawings of the scarves and rosettes, and the names of the places where the bands were to meet. All Paris discoursed for a week on the conspiracy of the Halles. The police looked the personification of mystery and importance. It was generally believed that the whole of the Quartier was undermined. At the Corps Legislatif the excitement was so great that the Centre and the Right forgot the untoward law of endowment which had momentarily divided them, and became reconciled, voting, by an overpowering majority, for the imposition of an unpopular tax, of which the faubourgs dared not complain, so great was the panic in the city. Florent was considerably amazed at the exaggerated number of accomplices which were given to him, and the trial lasted a week. Logre was acquitted, as was Lacaille. Alexandre was given 2 years in prison, and Gavard, like Florent, was condemned to transportation. This was a terrible blow to the old man, who was thus made to pay dearly, for what he regarded more as a frolic than anything else, and the tears streamed down the frightened face of this white-haired gamin. One morning in August, just as the markets were beginning to be astir, Claude Lantier went to Madame Fran9ois, who sat with a sad face among her vegetables. The painter was very quiet, notwithstanding the golden sun that lay on the green velvet of the cabbages by her side. "Well," he said, "it is all over. They are sending him away. He is far on his way to Brest by this time." The market woman made a gesture of profound despair. She waved her hands and said : "It is Paris — this horrible Paris." "No, Madame," answered Claude, "it is all these wretched people. You have no idea of the falsehoods they told in court, nor of the follies they committed. Will you believe that they even brought forward the child's writing books?" Claude clenched his fists. He was seized with a nervous shiver, and pulled his coat up. "Never was there a more gentle soul," he said. "I once saw him turn pale at seeing a pigeon killed. I absolutely laughed with pity when I saw him between the 2 gendarmes. I loved him because he was good and honorable. We shall never see him again." "He ought to have listened to me," said the market woman. "He should have come to Nanterre and lived there with me and my rabbits. He liked me and I loved him because I knew that I could trust him." "Ah, me! Come and see me some morning, Monsieur Claude. I will make an omelette for you. It is a pity, and he might have been so happy." Tears filled her eyes. She rose to her feet, with the air of a woman who is determined to shake off all her troubles. "Here comes Mother Chantemesse after her turnips," she said. Claude sauntered off. The markets were beginning to look very gay. He saw La Sarriette, with a gold watch stuck in her belt, busy with her prunes and strawberries, stopping from time to time to pull the whiskers of her friend Jules, who wore a new short velvet coat. He saw Madame Lecoeur and Mademoiselle Saget, less yellow than they used to be, laughing immoderately at some story the old maid was telling. In the fish market, Mother Mehuden, who had resumed her stall, reigned triumphant over the new inspector, a very young man, while Claire languidly placed in her tank a quantity of shining whitings. At the tripe stall, Auguste and Augustine were whispering over the pig's feet they were buying, with that unmistakable air of a newly married people. As he walked past the charcuterie, Much and Pauline were playing horse in front of the shop door. Much was on all fours, while Pauline, seated on his back, clutched at his hair to preserve her balance. On the roof of the Halles he saw two shadows. They were those of Cadine and Marjolin, kissing each other. Claude said to himself, with a sardonic smile, that it was the old story. The fat people had, as usual, triumphed. Here they all were, hearty and well, and Florent pushed to the wall. As he stood, facing la Rue Pirouette, the spectacle on his right and his left put the finishing touch to his exasperation. On the right side of the street, La belle Normande, or as she was now called, La belle Madame Lebigre, stood at the door of her shop. Her husband had obtained permission to add to his wine shop a counter for the sale of tobacco. This had been a favorite dream of his, now gratified for sundry mysterious services rendered. Madame Lebigre was really superb, in her silk dress and crimped hair, arrayed in all this glory to take her seat at the counter, where the gentlemen of the Quartier came to buy their cigars and packages of tobacco. She looked quite the lady, and everything was new and shining about her. Opposite, La belle Lisa occupied the entire width of her door. Never had her linen been so immaculate, never had her face worn a more peaceful aspect, framed as it was by her shining hair. She seemed to be too tranquilly happy even to smile. She was the personification of absolute contentment. Her dimpled hands were half hidden in her apron. They were not even extended to receive the happiness of the day, so sure was she that it would come to her. The shop, too, had resumed its former air of gaiety. The tongues and the sausages no longer had that disconsolate air which so disturbed Quenu. From the kitchen came a gay, resounding laugh, accompanied by a rattling of saucepans; and all about the shop indicated that the unfortunate episode of Florent's sojourn was totally forgotten. The two women leaned forward, and exchanged a cordial greeting, and Claude, who perhaps had not dined the previous evening, was filled with rage at seeing them so prosperous and comfortable. He drew his belt tighter and said angrily, "What scoundrels honest men can be!" End of Chapter 6. End of The Markets of Paris, by Emile Zola. Recorded by Céline Major.